a man whose ideas continue to shake the foundations of our moral, religious and cultural assumptions more than a century after his death. Born in 1844 in the small Prussian town of Rocken, Nietzsche grew up in a world undergoing rapid and traumatic transformation. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society. Scientific discoveries were undermining traditional religious beliefs, and the old aristocratic order was crumbling before the forces of democracy and mass culture. Into this chaos stepped a brilliant and tormented mind that would diagnose the spiritual crisis of modernity with unprecedented clarity and propose solutions so radical that they still terrify and inspire us today. Nietzsche was not merely an academic philosopher spinning abstract theories in ivory tower isolation. He lived his philosophy with devastating intensity, paying the ultimate price when his mind shattered under the weight of his own insights. His works read like dispatches from the front lines of a cultural war between the dying Christian civilization and an uncertain future that he saw emerging. Every page burns with prophetic urgency as he attempts to prepare humanity for the greatest transformation in its history. What makes Nietzsche so compelling and disturbing is his refusal to offer easy consolations or false hopes. He forces us to confront the most uncomfortable truths about human nature, morality, and the meaning of existence. His philosophy is not for the weak-minded or spiritually timid. It demands that we question everything we have been taught about good and evil, truth and falsehood, life and death. Yet for those brave enough to follow him into the abyss, Nietzsche promises something unprecedented in human history, the possibility of creating our own meaning and becoming our own gods. Part 1. The Death of God and the Crisis of Western Civilization. When Nietzsche proclaimed through his madman character that God is dead and we have killed him, he was not making a simple atheistic statement or celebrating the decline of religious belief. He was diagnosing what he saw as the greatest catastrophe in human history and the most profound spiritual crisis that Western civilization had ever faced. The death of God represented far more than the loss of religious faith. It meant the collapse of the entire framework of meaning, morality and purpose that had sustained European culture for over 1500 years. To understand the full significance of this declaration, we must grasp how completely Christianity had penetrated every aspect of Western life and thought. For medieval Europeans, God was not simply one belief among others, but the absolute foundation upon which all reality rested. Every moral law, every political authority, every social institution, every artistic creation, and every individual life derived its meaning and justification from its relationship to the divine order. The king ruled by divine right, the church interpreted God's will, the university taught sacred truth, and every person's ultimate destiny lay in their relationship with their Creator. This Christian worldview provided what Nietzsche called a metaphysical comfort that made human existence bearable, despite its inevitable suffering and apparent absurdity. When tragedy struck, when injustice flourished, when death claimed the innocent, believers could console themselves that everything happened according to God's mysterious but ultimately benevolent plan. Earthly suffering was temporary and would be compensated by eternal bliss for the righteous. Every human life, no matter how humble or painful, had infinite value because it was created and loved by God. This cosmic perspective gave people the strength to endure hardship and find meaning in the most difficult circumstances. But Nietzsche observed that this consoling worldview was collapsing under the combined assault of modern science, historical criticism, and philosophical skepticism. The scientific revolution had revealed a universe governed by mechanical laws rather than divine providence. Darwin's theory of evolution showed that humans were products of blind natural selection rather than special divine creation. Historical and archaeological research had revealed the human origins of supposedly sacred texts and traditions. Philosophers like Kant had demonstrated the limits of human reason and the impossibility of proving God's existence through rational argument. Most devastating of all, Nietzsche recognized that educated Europeans no longer genuinely believed in Christian doctrine, even when they continued to pay lip service to it. They went through the motions of religious observance out of habit, social conformity, or fear of consequences, but their hearts and minds had already abandoned the faith of their ancestors. This created what Nietzsche saw as a massive cultural dishonesty and spiritual hypocrisy. People pretended to believe what they no longer actually believed, creating a civilization built on lies and bad faith. The psychological consequences of this spiritual crisis were devastating. When people lose faith in the ultimate meaning and purpose of existence, they typically experience what Nietzsche called nihilism, the belief that life is fundamentally meaningless and all values are arbitrary human constructions. Without God as the supreme lawgiver and judge, how could anyone distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil, truth and falsehood? Without eternal life as the ultimate goal, what was the point of moral struggle, artistic creation, or intellectual achievement? If humans are merely sophisticated animals destined for extinction, why should their brief existence matter at all? Nietzsche predicted that this nihilistic crisis would unfold in several stages as its implications became clear to more and more people. First would come a period of desperate attempts to preserve Christian morality while abandoning Christian metaphysics. Thinkers would try to maintain traditional moral codes by grounding them in reason, natural law, or social utility rather than divine command. But Nietzsche argued that these secular foundations were too weak to support the enormous weight of Christian moral demands. Why should rational beings sacrifice themselves for others if there is no eternal reward for such behavior? Why should natural creatures transcend their biological instincts if there is no higher purpose to existence? The second stage would involve the gradual recognition that traditional morality cannot survive without its religious foundation. People would begin to see moral rules as arbitrary social conventions rather than eternal truths. This would lead to increasing cynicism, relativism, and moral confusion as different groups promoted conflicting value systems without any objective way to adjudicate between them. The result would be what Nietzsche called the last men, creatures who had lost all sense of greatness, purpose, and meaning. They would seek only comfort, security and pleasure while avoiding all risk, challenge and genuine commitment. But Nietzsche also saw tremendous creative potential in this crisis. The death of God cleared away the old idols and opened up space for humanity to create new forms of meaning and value. Just as a forest fire destroys old growth but prepares the ground for new life, the collapse of Christianity could prepare the way for a higher form of human existence. The question was whether humanity would have the courage and creativity to seize this unprecedented opportunity or would sink into decadent nihilism. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes both most challenging and most inspiring. He argued that the death of God, rather than being a disaster, could become the greatest liberation in human history if people were brave enough to embrace its implications. For the first time, humans would be free to create their own values, forge their own destinies, and become their own gods. But this freedom came with a terrible price: complete responsibility for the meaning and direction of human existence. There would be no external authority to blame for failure, no cosmic guarantee of justice, and no ultimate consolation for suffering. Humanity would have to grow up and take full responsibility for its own fate. The death of God also had profound implications for how we understand truth, knowledge, and reality itself. If there is no divine perspective from which to view the universe objectively, then all human knowledge becomes perspectival and provisional. What we call truth reflects the particular needs, interests, and limitations of the human species, rather than eternal and unchanging facts about reality. This insight would later influence developments in psychology, sociology, anthropology, and even physics as thinkers began to recognize how profoundly human factors shape what we take to be objective knowledge. Politically and socially, the death of God undermined all traditional forms of authority and hierarchy. If kings do not rule by divine right, if priests do not speak for God, and if moral laws are human creations, then what justifies existing power structures and social arrangements? Nietzsche predicted that the collapse of religious authority would lead to increasing democratization, egalitarianism, and mass culture, as people lost faith in aristocratic ideals and natural hierarchies. But he saw this levelling process as potentially destructive of human excellence and greatness. Without belief in higher purposes and transcendent values, people would sink to the lowest common denominator and lose all aspiration for self-improvement and cultural achievement. Yet Nietzsche also recognized that some individuals might respond to the death of God by becoming stronger, more creative, and more life-affirming than ever before. These rare souls would embrace the terrible freedom of a godless universe and use it to forge new possibilities for human existence. They would become what he called free spirits, individuals who had liberated themselves from the need for external authority and learned to create their own meaning and purpose. These exceptional beings would point the way toward a post-Christian future that could surpass even the greatest achievements of the religious past. The death of God therefore represents both the greatest crisis and the greatest opportunity in human history. It forces us to confront ultimate questions about the nature and purpose of existence without the comfort of traditional answers. But it also opens up unprecedented possibilities for human creativity, self-determination, and spiritual growth. The question Nietzsche poses to every reader is whether they have the courage to live without God and the strength to create something worthy to take his place. Part 2. The problem of nihilism and its psychological stages. Nihilism represents far more than simple disbelief or skepticism. For Nietzsche, it constitutes the fundamental disease of modern Western civilization, a spiritual poison that slowly destroys the human capacity for meaning, purpose, and creative action. When people lose faith in absolute values and transcendent purposes, they do not simply become neutral or indifferent. Instead, they experience a profound existential crisis that can manifest in various psychological and cultural forms, each more destructive than the last. Nietzsche distinguished between several types of nihilism based on how individuals and cultures respond to the collapse of traditional meaning systems. The first and most obvious form is what he called passive nihilism, characterized by resignation, despair, and spiritual exhaustion. People who fall into passive nihilism recognize that their old beliefs no longer make sense, but they lack the energy or courage to create new ones. Instead, they withdraw from life, seeking comfort in routine, entertainment, or various forms of escapism. They become what Nietzsche mockingly called the last men, creatures who blink and ask what is happiness, while pursuing only the most shallow and immediate pleasures. Passive nihilists often display what appears to be moral behavior, but their actions lack genuine conviction or passionate commitment. They follow social conventions out of habit or fear rather than deep belief in their validity. They speak about justice, compassion and human dignity, but these words have become empty shells, divorced from any living faith or personal investment. Their lives become mechanical repetitions of inherited patterns without any sense of higher purpose or ultimate significance. This type of nihilism is particularly dangerous because it appears respectable and reasonable while slowly draining all vitality from human culture. The second form is active nihilism, which involves the violent destruction of existing values and institutions without creating anything positive to replace them. Active nihilists recognize the meaninglessness of traditional beliefs and respond with rage, resentment, and destructive energy. They tear down churches, overthrow governments, and attack moral authorities, but their actions stem from hatred rather than love, from the desire to destroy rather than the urge to create. Nietzsche saw this type of nihilism emerging in the revolutionary movements of his era, particularly in Russian anarchism and German socialism. Active nihilists often possess tremendous energy and determination, but they channel these qualities in purely negative directions. They know what they are against, but have no clear vision of what they are for. Their criticism of existing institutions may be accurate and necessary, but they offer no constructive alternatives to fill the vacuum they create. This leads to cycles of revolution and counter-revolution, destruction and restoration, without any genuine progress toward higher forms of human organization. The result is often worse than what existed before, as new forms of tyranny emerge to fill the chaos left by the destruction of old authorities. But Nietzsche also recognized a third possibility that he called complete nihilism or nihilism overcome. This represents the full recognition and acceptance of meaninglessness as a prelude to creating new forms of meaning and value. Complete nihilists do not become stuck in despair or rage, but move through these stages toward something higher and more creative. They understand that the absence of objective meaning creates space for subjective meaning creation, that the death of God opens the possibility of human divinity. The psychological journey toward complete nihilism involves several distinct phases that Nietzsche traced with remarkable precision. The first phase typically begins in adolescence or early adulthood, when intelligent and sensitive individuals start to question the beliefs they inherited from their families and communities. They discover contradictions in religious doctrines, recognize the human origins of supposedly divine revelations, or encounter scientific evidence that conflicts with traditional teachings. This initial doubt often produces excitement and a sense of intellectual liberation, as people feel freed from constraining superstitions and dogmas. The second phase involves the gradual recognition that the loss of religious belief has far more extensive implications than initially realized. If God does not exist, then moral laws become arbitrary human preferences rather than eternal truths. If there is no afterlife, then justice becomes impossible, since the wicked often prosper while the righteous suffer. If humans are merely animals, then concepts like dignity, rights and purpose lose their foundation. This recognition typically produces anxiety, depression, and a desperate search for secular alternatives to religious meaning. The third phase occurs when these secular alternatives prove inadequate to bear the weight of human spiritual needs. Reason alone cannot generate compelling reasons for moral behavior or personal sacrifice. Science describes how the world works but provides no guidance about how we should live or what we should value. Political ideologies promise earthly salvation but deliver only new forms of oppression and disappointment. Art and culture offer temporary escape from meaninglessness but cannot create lasting significance or purpose. This phase often produces the deepest despair as people realize that there may be no solution to the problem of meaning within existing intellectual and cultural resources. The fourth and most dangerous phase involves the temptation to embrace nihilism as a final truth rather than a transitional stage. Some people conclude that since life has no inherent meaning, nothing matters and all actions are equally valid or invalid. This can lead to moral relativism, cynical opportunism, or destructive hedonism as people abandon all restraints and commitments. Others may seek relief in various forms of fundamentalism, fanaticism, or ideological extremism that promise to restore absolute meaning through violent action. Both responses represent failures to move beyond nihilism toward genuine spiritual reconstruction. But Nietzsche also described a fifth phase, available only to the strongest and most creative individuals. These rare souls recognize nihilism as a necessary clearing away of false idols that prepares the ground for authentic value creation. Instead of lamenting the death of God, they celebrate it as the birth of human freedom and responsibility. Instead of seeking new authorities to replace the old ones, they learn to become authorities for themselves. Instead of demanding external validation for their choices, they develop the inner strength to create meaning through their own actions and commitments. This fifth phase requires what Nietzsche called a fundamental revaluation of the nihilistic experience itself. Rather than seeing the collapse of traditional meaning as a catastrophe, these individuals recognize it as the necessary precondition for human greatness. The very meaninglessness of existence becomes the canvas upon which they paint new possibilities for human flourishing. Their suffering through nihilism becomes the raw material for creating deeper wisdom and stronger character. Their confrontation with absurdity becomes the foundation for more authentic forms of life affirmation. Nietzsche argued that most people never reach this fifth phase because they lack the psychological strength and intellectual courage required for radical self-creation. They prefer the security of inherited beliefs, even false ones, to the terrifying freedom of making their own meaning. They would rather follow external authorities, even corrupt ones, than take full responsibility for their own lives and values. They choose the familiar misery of nihilistic despair over the unknown possibilities of spiritual rebirth. This is why Nietzsche saw nihilism not just as an individual psychological problem, but as a massive cultural and historical phenomenon that would shape the future of Western civilization. Entire societies could become nihilistic if they lost faith in their founding principles and purposes without developing new ones. The result would be what he called the wasteland, a world of spiritual emptiness, cultural decay, and human diminishment. Preventing this outcome would require exceptional individuals who could show others how to move through nihilism toward higher forms of existence. These would become the free spirits and overmen who could lead humanity into a post-nihilistic future. Part 3. Master and Slave Morality, the Hidden Psychology of Values. One of Nietzsche's most revolutionary and controversial insights concerns the psychological origins of moral systems. Rather than treating moral codes as eternal truths handed down by God or discovered by reason, he approached them as human creations that reflect the particular needs, drives, and circumstances of those who create them. This genealogical method revealed that what people call good and evil often has more to do with power relationships than with objective moral facts. By tracing moral concepts back to their psychological and social roots, Nietzsche uncovered a fundamental distinction between two types of morality that have competed throughout human history. Master morality originated among the strong, noble and powerful classes of ancient societies, particularly the warrior aristocracies that dominated early European civilization. These masters created moral concepts based on what they loved and admired in themselves and their peers. They called themselves good because they possessed the qualities they valued most highly: physical strength, courage in battle, aristocratic refinement, generous hospitality, fierce loyalty, and proud independence. Their goodness was not defined in opposition to evil, but simply as the spontaneous expression of their own excellence and vitality. When masters encountered people who lacked these qualities, they did not hate them or consider them morally corrupt. Instead, they simply found them contemptible or pitiable, using words like bad, common, or low to describe what they saw as natural inferiority. A master might feel the same way about a weak person that a healthy person feels about someone who is sick, recognizing a condition to be avoided, but not necessarily blaming the sufferer for their misfortune. Master morality was fundamentally life-affirming and self-celebrating rather than reactive or resentful. The masters lived according to what Nietzsche called the pathos of distance, maintaining clear distinctions between themselves and their social inferiors while taking responsibility for their own actions and values. They did not need external validation for their worth because they generated their own standards of excellence from within. Their moral code emphasized personal honor, individual achievement, and the cultivation of rare and difficult virtues that set them apart from the masses. They valued what was exceptional, dangerous, and great, rather than what was common, safe, and mediocre. This aristocratic morality produced some of the highest achievements in human culture, from the heroic ideals celebrated in Homer's epics to the philosophical greatness of Plato and Aristotle. Master morality encouraged people to strive for excellence, to take risks in pursuit of glory, and to develop their distinctive talents and capacities to the fullest extent possible. It celebrated human greatness rather than human equality, individual distinction rather than social conformity, and the realization of potential rather than the satisfaction of needs. Even today, we can see traces of master morality in our admiration for great artists, athletes, entrepreneurs, and other exceptional individuals who have achieved something remarkable through their own efforts. But Nietzsche also recognized that master morality had serious limitations and could become corrupt or decadent. When masters lost their vitality and became comfortable with inherited privilege rather than personal achievement, their morality could degenerate into mere snobbery and exploitation. When they used their power to oppress others rather than to elevate themselves, they betrayed the very principles that justified their superiority. When they became cruel or indifferent to suffering rather than magnanimous and protective, they revealed that their strength had become mere brutality. Slave morality emerged as a reaction against master morality among those who lacked the power, talent, or opportunity to compete according to aristocratic standards. Rather than accepting their inferior position or working to improve themselves, the slaves created an entirely different moral system that inverted traditional values and turned their weakness into virtue. What the masters called good became evil, and what the masters called bad became good, in a systematic reversal that Nietzsche described as one of the most clever and successful psychological strategies in human history. Through this moral revolution, the weak and oppressed could feel spiritually superior to their oppressors, without actually overcoming them in any material sense. Slave morality is fundamentally reactive and resentful, defining itself primarily through opposition to master values rather than through positive affirmation of its own ideals. The slave begins not by asking what is good, but by identifying what is evil, namely the qualities and actions of the masters. Strength becomes pride, and pride becomes sin. Courage becomes violence, and violence becomes wickedness. Independence becomes selfishness, and selfishness becomes immorality. Having defined evil in terms of master qualities, the slave then defines good as the opposite. Weakness becomes humility, submission becomes obedience, dependence becomes love. This reactive structure gives slave morality a fundamentally negative and life-denying character. Instead of celebrating what it loves, slave morality condemns what it hates, creating a moral system based more on prohibition than on promotion, more on guilt than on joy. The slave moralist spends more energy criticizing the powerful than developing his own capacities, more time demanding equality than achieving excellence, more effort resenting success than working toward it. This creates what Nietzsche called ressentiment, a toxic psychological state characterized by impotent rage, hidden envy, and systematic self-deception. Slave morality also employs what Nietzsche identified as a crucial psychological mechanism, the promise of future compensation for present suffering. Since slaves cannot overcome their masters in this life, they console themselves with fantasies of reversal in another life where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. This otherworldly orientation allows them to endure oppression without rebellion while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. But it also prevents them from taking effective action to improve their actual circumstances, keeping them trapped in cycles of resentment and impotence. The psychological appeal of slave morality extends far beyond its original social context among literally oppressed people. Anyone who feels inadequate, unsuccessful, or unfulfilled can find comfort in a moral system that makes virtues out of their limitations and vices out of others' achievements. The mediocre person can feel morally superior to the excellent person by condemning excellence as arrogance. The unsuccessful can criticize the successful as greedy or corrupt. The conformist can attack the nonconformist as selfish or antisocial. This allows people to maintain their self-esteem without actually improving themselves or taking responsibility for their failures. Nietzsche argued that Christianity represents the most successful and systematic expression of slave morality in human history. By teaching that the meek shall inherit the earth, that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven, and that the first shall be last, Christianity inverted traditional aristocratic values on a massive scale. The Christian virtues of humility, self-sacrifice, compassion, and equality directly oppose the pagan virtues of pride, self-assertion, excellence, and hierarchy. What had been considered natural and healthy expressions of human vitality became sins to be confessed and overcome. This Christian moral revolution succeeded in undermining the confidence and authority of Europe's ruling classes while providing psychological comfort to the masses. Aristocrats began to feel guilty about their privileges and power, questioning whether they deserved their advantages or whether they should be using them differently. Meanwhile, common people could maintain their dignity and hope despite material hardship by believing that their suffering made them more virtuous than their oppressors. The result was a gradual democratization of culture and the rise of egalitarian ideologies that continue to shape modern politics and society. But Nietzsche also recognized that the triumph of slave morality came at enormous cost to human creativity and achievement. By making virtues out of weakness and vices out of strength, it discouraged the very qualities that had produced the greatest accomplishments in art, philosophy, politics, and culture. By emphasizing equality over excellence, it promoted mediocrity and conformity rather than distinction and innovation. By focusing attention on an imaginary afterlife, it diminished investment in actual human potential and earthly achievement. The psychological damage inflicted by slave morality extends beyond its effects on exceptional individuals to its impact on ordinary people as well. By teaching people to feel guilty about their natural drives and desires, it creates internal conflicts that make genuine happiness and self-acceptance nearly impossible. By promising rewards that never come and demanding sacrifices that serve no real purpose, it generates cynicism and disappointment. By defining morality primarily through negation and prohibition, it fails to provide positive guidance for human flourishing and creative expression. Yet Nietzsche did not simply advocate a return to ancient master morality, which he recognized was no longer possible or desirable in modern circumstances. Instead, he called for a new synthesis that would combine the life-affirming aspects of master morality with a more sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social relationships. This new morality would celebrate strength without ignoring weakness, promote excellence without despising mediocrity, and affirm individual greatness without denying social responsibility. It would be created by individuals who had overcome both the naivety of traditional master morality and the resentment of traditional slave morality, to forge something entirely new and more adequate to human needs and possibilities. Part 4. The Will to Power, the Hidden Drive Behind All Life. At the very heart of Nietzsche's mature philosophy lies his most fundamental and controversial insight, the will to power as the basic drive underlying all living things. This concept represents his attempt to provide a naturalistic explanation for human behavior and cultural development that could replace both religious accounts based on divine will and scientific accounts based on mechanical causation. The will to power is not simply one drive among others, but the fundamental impulse from which all other drives and desires emerge. It operates at every level of existence, from the basic biological processes that maintain life to the highest achievements of human culture and creativity. Nietzsche developed this theory gradually over the course of his philosophical career as he sought to understand what really motivates human actions beneath the surface of conscious intentions and moral justifications. He became convinced that neither the pursuit of pleasure nor the avoidance of pain could adequately explain the complexity and intensity of human behavior. People often seek suffering, sacrifice immediate pleasures for long-term goals, and engage in activities that provide no obvious hedonic benefits. Similarly, the mere desire for survival seemed insufficient to account for human creativity, risk-taking, and the pursuit of excellence beyond what is necessary for mere existence. The will to power, by contrast, could explain both self-destructive and self-transcending behaviors as expressions of the same underlying drive. When someone sacrifices their immediate comfort for a higher cause, they are exercising power over their own impulses and extending their influence into the future. When an artist creates a masterpiece despite poverty and criticism, they are asserting their vision against the resistance of both material circumstances and social opposition. When a philosopher challenges accepted beliefs despite personal risk, they are attempting to reshape human understanding according to their own insights and values. But Nietzsche insisted that the will to power should not be understood primarily in terms of domination over other people. though it can certainly take that form. More fundamentally, it represents the drive to grow, expand, develop, and realize one's potential, regardless of external obstacles or limitations. Every living thing seeks not just to survive, but to thrive, not just to maintain itself, but to enhance itself, not just to react to its environment, but to shape and transform it according to its own nature and needs. The will to power is thus essentially creative and life-affirming rather than merely destructive or parasitic. This creative aspect of the will to power becomes most evident in human cultural achievements, where people transform raw materials, ideas and experiences into new forms of beauty, truth and meaning. The scientist who discovers natural laws is exercising power over the chaos of empirical data by organizing it into coherent theoretical structures. The artist who creates beautiful works is exercising power over formless matter by shaping it according to aesthetic visions. The moral reformer who challenges existing values is exercising power over inherited traditions by subjecting them to critical evaluation and transformation. In each case, the will to power manifests as the drive to impose form on formlessness, meaning on meaninglessness, and order on chaos. This is why Nietzsche often described it in terms of artistic metaphors, comparing the person who exercises will to power effectively to a sculptor who creates beautiful forms from raw stone, or a composer who creates harmonious music from individual sounds. The will to power is fundamentally aesthetic, in that it seeks to create something beautiful, powerful, and meaningful, rather than merely useful or pleasant. This aesthetic dimension distinguishes it from cruder forms of power seeking that aim only at domination or exploitation. However, Nietzsche also recognized that the will to power could take unhealthy and destructive forms when it became twisted by resentment, weakness, or psychological dysfunction. People who lack the strength or opportunity to create positive expressions of power may turn to negative ones, seeking to diminish others rather than elevate themselves. This reactive form of will to power underlies much of what Nietzsche criticized in slave morality, where people try to gain power by making others feel guilty rather than by developing their own capacities and achievements. It also appears in various forms of nihilistic destruction, where people tear down existing institutions and values without creating anything better to replace them. The key distinction is between ascending and descending forms of will to power. Ascending forms are characterized by creativity, generosity, self-overcoming, and the ability to affirm life despite its difficulties and contradictions. People who embody ascending will to power become stronger, more capable and more life-affirming over time, developing their potential in ways that often benefit others as well as themselves. Descending forms are characterized by resentment, destructiveness, self-deception, and the tendency to blame others for one's own failures and limitations. People caught in descending will to power become weaker, more bitter, and more life-denying over time, spreading their dysfunction to others around them. This distinction has profound implications for how we understand moral and cultural evaluation. Rather than judging actions according to abstract principles or divine commands, Nietzsche proposed that we evaluate them based on whether they represent ascending or descending expressions of will to power. Does a particular moral code or cultural practice enhance human capacities and creative potential, or does it diminish them? Does it promote the development of stronger, more capable and more life-affirming individuals, or does it create weakness, dependency and resentment? These become the crucial questions for determining the value of any moral or cultural system. Applied to individual psychology, the will to power helps explain many otherwise puzzling aspects of human behavior. People often pursue goals that make no sense from the perspective of pleasure maximization or pain avoidance, but make perfect sense as expressions of the drive for growth, mastery, and self-realization. The athlete who endures grueling training, the student who studies difficult subjects, the entrepreneur who risks everything on a new venture, all are responding to the will to power rather than seeking immediate gratification or security. Even apparently altruistic behaviors like charity, teaching, or political activism can represent expressions of will to power when they allow people to extend their influence and realize their values in the world. The will to power also operates at unconscious and semi-conscious levels, shaping human perception, interpretation, and evaluation in ways that people rarely recognize. We tend to notice and remember information that confirms our existing beliefs and ignore or forget information that challenges them, not necessarily because we are dishonest, but because our will to power seeks to maintain and expand our current worldview. We interpret ambiguous situations in ways that support our interests and goals, often without realizing that alternative interpretations are possible or reasonable. We form emotional attachments to ideas, people, and institutions that enhance our sense of power and meaning, while feeling hostile toward those that threaten or diminish us. This perspectival aspect of the will to power led Nietzsche to question traditional distinctions between objective truth and subjective opinion. If all human understanding is shaped by the will to power, then what we call truth may be nothing more than those interpretations that successfully enhance our capacity to navigate and manipulate our environment. Scientific theories succeed not because they correspond to objective reality, but because they give us power to predict and control natural phenomena. Moral systems succeed not because they reflect eternal values, but because they effectively organize social cooperation and individual development. Artistic works succeed not because they express universal beauty, but because they enhance our capacity for aesthetic experience and emotional expression. This does not mean that Nietzsche embraced complete relativism where all perspectives are equally valid. Some expressions of will to power are clearly more successful than others at achieving their goals and enhancing life. The question is not whether our beliefs correspond to some impossible objective standpoint, but whether they effectively serve our deepest drives and highest aspirations. A perspective that consistently leads to weakness, failure, and life denial reveals itself as an expression of declining will to power, regardless of its logical consistency or social acceptability. Understanding human behavior in terms of will to power also provides new insights into social and political phenomena. Different groups and classes express their will to power in different ways, depending on their circumstances, capabilities, and historical position. Aristocratic classes typically express it through direct action, cultural creation, and the cultivation of individual excellence, while oppressed classes may express it through moral criticism, revolutionary ideology, or the promise of future compensation. Neither expression is inherently superior, but they produce very different types of individuals and cultures with different strengths and limitations. The ultimate significance of the will to power lies in its potential to provide a new foundation for human values and cultural development after the death of God. Instead of grounding morality in divine commands or abstract principles, we can evaluate different ways of life based on whether they enhance or diminish the creative and life-affirming expressions of will to power. This provides objective criteria for cultural criticism without requiring belief in supernatural authorities or metaphysical absolutes. It also suggests new possibilities for individual and social development based on the conscious cultivation of ascending forms of will to power rather than reactive or resentful ones. Part 5. The Übermensch, Humanity's Highest Possibility. The concept of the Übermensch represents Nietzsche's most ambitious and inspiring vision of what human beings might become once they have successfully overcome the nihilistic crisis of modernity. Often mistranslated as Superman, the German word literally means overman or overhuman, suggesting not a superhero with magical powers, but a type of human being who has transcended the limitations and contradictions that characterize ordinary humanity. The Overman is Nietzsche's answer to the question of what comes after God. What new form of meaning and value can emerge from the ruins of traditional religious and moral systems? He represents the possibility of human self-creation and self-determination taken to their ultimate conclusion. To understand the full significance of this concept, we must recognize that Nietzsche saw ordinary human beings as fundamentally conflicted and incomplete creatures caught between their animal nature and their spiritual aspirations. Most people live in a state of internal contradiction, professing beliefs they do not really hold, pursuing goals they do not genuinely desire, and accepting values that diminish rather than enhance their lives. They are shaped more by external forces like social pressure, cultural conditioning, and unconscious drives than by conscious choice and authentic self-expression. The result is a kind of spiritual inauthenticity where people become strangers to themselves, living according to scripts written by others rather than creating their own destinies. The Overman, by contrast, has achieved complete integration and self-mastery. He has reconciled his animal and spiritual dimensions, his individual desires and social responsibilities, his need for stability, and his drive for growth and change. Rather than being torn apart by contradictory impulses and conflicting demands, he has forged them into a harmonious whole that serves his own deepest purposes and highest aspirations. He has become what Nietzsche called a unity, a person whose thoughts, feelings and actions all flow from the same source and serve the same ultimate goals. This integration is achieved through what Nietzsche described as self-overcoming, a process of continuous growth and self-transformation that never reaches a final endpoint. The Overman does not simply accept himself as he is, but constantly works to become more than what he is, pushing against his own limitations and exploring new possibilities for human existence. He treats himself as raw material to be sculpted into a work of art, applying the same creative energy to self-development that great artists apply to their masterpieces. This requires tremendous discipline, self-awareness and courage, since it means abandoning the security of fixed identity in favor of the uncertainty of continuous becoming. The Overman's relationship to traditional moral and religious authorities is particularly crucial to understanding his significance. Rather than rejecting all external guidance out of adolescent rebellion, he has developed the intellectual sophistication to evaluate different moral systems based on their practical effects on human flourishing and creative potential. He may adopt certain traditional moral practices if they serve his purposes, but he does so consciously and provisionally rather than out of blind obedience or social conformity. When existing moral codes conflict with his deeper understanding of what enhances life and promotes excellence, he has the courage to create new values that better serve these fundamental goals. This process of value creation is perhaps the most distinctive characteristic of the Overman. Rather than seeking validation from external authorities or conforming to inherited traditions, he generates his own standards of meaning and worth from within. He becomes what Nietzsche called a lawgiver, someone who creates new possibilities for human existence rather than merely following existing patterns. This requires not only intellectual independence but also tremendous psychological strength, since it means taking full responsibility for one's choices without the comfort of knowing that one is following a predetermined path sanctioned by higher authorities. The overman's approach to suffering and adversity also sets him apart from ordinary humanity. Rather than seeking to avoid difficulty or demanding that life be fair and pleasant, he embraces challenge and even seeks out experiences that will test and develop his capacities. He understands that growth requires resistance, that strength comes from overcoming obstacles, and that the most meaningful achievements are often the most difficult ones. This does not mean that he is masochistic or that he enjoys pain for its own sake, but rather that he has developed the perspective and psychological resources necessary to transform suffering into strength and setbacks into opportunities for development. This attitude toward adversity reflects a deeper philosophical principle that Nietzsche called amor fati, or love of fate. The overman has achieved such complete integration and self-acceptance that he would not want to change anything about his life, even the painful and difficult parts. He recognizes that his struggles and failures have been just as important as his successes in making him who he is, and he affirms his entire existence without reservation or regret. This represents the highest form of life affirmation possible, going beyond mere resignation or stoic acceptance to achieve genuine love and gratitude for one's entire experience. The social and political implications of the overman concept are complex and often misunderstood. Nietzsche did not envision the overman as a political ruler or social leader who would dominate others through force or manipulation. Indeed, he often suggested that the overman would be relatively indifferent to ordinary political concerns, focusing instead on his own self-development and creative projects. His influence on others would come through inspiration and example, rather than through command and control, showing new possibilities for human existence rather than demanding that others follow his particular path. Nevertheless, the overman's very existence would have profound cultural and social effects. By demonstrating that human beings can transcend their apparent limitations and create new forms of meaning and value, he would challenge the assumptions and complacency of ordinary society. His achievements in art, philosophy, science, or other creative endeavours would expand the range of human possibility and inspire others to pursue their own forms of self-overcoming. Even if most people never became overmen themselves, they might benefit from living in a culture that had been shaped by overhuman achievements and aspirations. The relationship between the overman and other people is thus more complex than simple domination or indifference. While the overman does not seek to rule others in any conventional sense, he also cannot avoid having an impact on those around him through his very existence and achievements. His independence from conventional values and authorities implicitly challenges those who remain dependent on external validation and inherited traditions. His creative accomplishments raise questions about why others are content with mediocrity and conformity. His ability to find meaning and purpose in a godless universe demonstrates that the nihilistic despair affecting modern culture is not inevitable or insurmountable. Nietzsche also emphasized that becoming an overman is not a matter of intellectual understanding alone, but requires practical transformation of one's entire way of being. It is not enough to agree with Nietzsche's ideas or to understand his arguments conceptually. The overman must actually live differently, think differently, feel differently, and relate to others differently than ordinary human beings. This transformation typically requires years or decades of intense self-work, including psychological insight, spiritual discipline, and creative experimentation. Most people lack either the ability or the motivation for such radical self-transformation, which is why Nietzsche expected the Overman to remain rare and exceptional. The question of whether anyone has ever actually achieved the status of Overman remains open and debatable. Nietzsche sometimes suggested that certain historical figures like Goethe, Napoleon or Caesar came close to embodying overhuman qualities. But he also emphasized that the Overman represents a future possibility rather than a past achievement. The death of God and the crisis of traditional values create both the necessity and the opportunity for overhuman development. But whether anyone will actually seize this opportunity remains to be seen. The Overman thus functions both as an inspiring ideal and as a practical goal, challenging readers to examine their own lives and consider what they might become if they had the courage to embrace radical self-transformation. Contemporary readers often struggle with the Overman concept because it seems to promote elitism, individualism, or even fascistic ideologies. But Nietzsche consistently emphasized that overhuman greatness must be earned through personal achievement rather than inherited through birth or imposed through political power. The Overman creates his own nobility through self-overcoming rather than claiming it through social position or group membership. His superiority is demonstrated through creative accomplishment rather than asserted through force or propaganda. While this may result in natural hierarchies based on ability and achievement, it is fundamentally different from the arbitrary hierarchies based on race, class, or political ideology that have caused so much suffering in human history. Ultimately, the Overman represents Nietzsche's vision of what human beings might become if they fully embraced their freedom and responsibility in a universe without God or predetermined purpose. Rather than remaining forever dependent on external authorities for meaning and guidance, individuals could learn to create their own values and purposes through conscious self-development and creative expression. Rather than remaining trapped in the conflicts and contradictions of ordinary human existence, they could achieve integration and wholeness through systematic self-overcoming. Rather than despairing over the apparent meaninglessness of existence, they could create new forms of meaning that affirm and enhance life rather than diminish it. The Overman thus represents both a solution to the crisis of modernity and a new chapter in the human story. Part 6. Eternal Recurrence. The ultimate test of life affirmation. The doctrine of eternal recurrence stands as perhaps the most haunting and transformative idea in Nietzsche's entire philosophical system. It represents both his deepest insight into the nature of existence and his most demanding test of whether someone has truly overcome nihilism and achieved authentic life affirmation. The basic idea appears deceptively simple. Imagine that your entire life, with all its joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures, moments of ecstasy and periods of suffering, would repeat itself exactly the same way infinite times throughout eternity. Every decision you make, every word you speak, every thought you think, every sensation you experience would occur again and again without the slightest variation for all time. Nietzsche first encountered this idea not as a philosophical concept but as a sudden, overwhelming vision that struck him while walking near a massive rock formation in the Swiss Alps. He described the experience as a kind of revelation that transformed his understanding of existence and provided the emotional foundation for all his subsequent philosophical work. The thought filled him with both terror and exultation, forcing him to confront fundamental questions about the value and meaning of human existence that had been haunting him since his youth. If everything repeats exactly, then every moment becomes invested with infinite significance, since it will occur not just once but countless times throughout eternity. From one perspective, Eternal recurrence appears to be a cosmological theory about the physical structure of the universe. Nietzsche speculated that if the universe contains only finite matter and energy operating according to fixed natural laws, then every possible combination of events must eventually repeat itself. Given infinite time and finite possibilities, the exact arrangement of atoms that constitutes your present moment must have occurred before and will occur again, along with all the events that led up to it and all the consequences that flow from it. This would mean that eternal recurrence is not just a thought experiment, but a literal description of how reality actually works. However, Nietzsche was more interested in the psychological and spiritual implications of this idea than in its scientific validity. Whether or not eternal recurrence is literally true, contemplating it forces us to examine our fundamental attitude toward existence and our deepest assumptions about what makes life worth living. If you knew that your life would repeat exactly as you are living it, now infinite times, would you be filled with joy or horror, gratitude or despair, excitement or dread? Your honest response to this question reveals more about your spiritual condition than any amount of abstract philosophical reflection. Most people, if they truly contemplated eternal recurrence, would be overwhelmed by horror and despair. They would focus immediately on the painful, embarrassing or traumatic experiences they have endured and the prospect of having to endure them again and again forever. They would think about their failures, their weaknesses, their missed opportunities, their boring or meaningless moments, and they would cry out that once was more than enough for such experiences. They would demand the right to edit their lives, to keep the good parts and eliminate the bad parts, to learn from their mistakes and do better the next time around. This horrified response reveals what Nietzsche saw as the fundamental life denial that characterizes most human existence. People may claim to love life and to be grateful for their existence, but when pressed to affirm their actual lives in all their concrete details, they reveal that they fundamentally reject large portions of their experience. They want life to be different than it is, better than it is, more pleasant and meaningful than it actually has been for them. They live in constant comparison between their actual existence and some idealized alternative that they believe would be more worthy of repetition. But Nietzsche also recognized that a rare few individuals might respond to eternal recurrence with genuine joy and affirmation. These people have achieved such complete acceptance of their existence that they would not want to change anything about it, even if they had the power to do so. They have integrated their suffering and their joy, their failures and their successes, their boring moments and their peak experiences into a coherent whole that they can love without reservation. They understand that their struggles and disappointments have been just as necessary and valuable as their achievements and pleasures in making them who they are. This attitude of complete life affirmation represents what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, which he considered the highest spiritual achievement possible for human beings. It goes beyond mere acceptance or resignation to reach genuine gratitude and joy for one's entire existence exactly as it has unfolded. The person who has achieved amor fati does not love life in spite of its difficulties and contradictions, but because of them, recognizing that suffering and challenge are essential elements in any life worth living. They have learned to find meaning and beauty even in experiences that others would consider purely negative or meaningless. The test of eternal recurrence also reveals the difference between authentic and inauthentic forms of self-acceptance and spiritual development. Many people claim to have made peace with their past and to be grateful for their experiences, but their response to eternal recurrence would expose the superficiality of such claims. True amor fati means being willing to live your exact same life infinite times, not some improved version or idealized interpretation of it. It means affirming not just your conscious choices and proud achievements, but also your unconscious reactions, your petty jealousies, your moments of cowardice or cruelty, your periods of confusion or despair. This radical form of self-acceptance does not mean becoming passive or fatalistic about the future. The person who truly embraces eternal recurrence would continue to make efforts, pursue goals, and seek improvement just as before, but they would do so from a fundamentally different psychological foundation. Their actions would flow from love and creative energy, rather than from dissatisfaction and the desire to escape their current condition. They would engage with life more fully and authentically because they would not be constantly comparing their present reality to some imaginary alternative. Eternal recurrence also functions as a practical guide for making decisions and evaluating different courses of action. Before making any choice, you can ask yourself, am I prepared to make this same choice infinite times, knowing all its consequences and implications? This test eliminates actions motivated by temporary emotions, social pressure, or short-term thinking, while highlighting choices that reflect your deepest values and authentic nature. It forces you to take full responsibility for your decisions by imagining their infinite repetition rather than treating them as one-time experiments that can be reversed or forgotten. The social and cultural implications of eternal recurrence are equally profound. A society composed of individuals who truly embrace this doctrine would be fundamentally different from our current culture in almost every respect. People would be much more careful and deliberate about their choices, knowing that every action carries infinite weight and significance. They would be more authentic and honest in their relationships, unable to justify temporary deceptions or manipulations by appealing to future corrections or improvements. They would focus more on creating genuine meaning and beauty in their present circumstances rather than constantly seeking escape to supposedly better conditions. Nietzsche also connected eternal recurrence to his vision of the Übermensch, suggesting that the ability to joyfully affirm one's eternal repetition represents one of the key characteristics of overhuman existence. The Übermensch has achieved such complete self-mastery and creative integration that he can love his fate without reservation, finding infinite value in experiences that ordinary people would consider worthless or harmful. His response to eternal recurrence would be not just acceptance but enthusiastic embrace, seeing the infinite repetition of his existence as the ultimate validation of his creative achievements and self-overcoming. He would cry out with genuine joy, "Was that life? Well then, once again." The relationship between eternal recurrence and traditional religious concepts of eternity and salvation provides another crucial dimension of this doctrine. Christianity promises eternal life as a reward for proper belief and moral behavior, but this eternal life takes place in a heavenly realm that transcends and negates earthly existence. The Christian heaven represents everything that earthly life is not: perfect rather than flawed, peaceful rather than conflicted, static rather than changing, spiritual rather than physical. This otherworldly orientation implicitly devalues actual human experience in favor of an imaginary alternative that may not even exist. Eternal recurrence, by contrast, makes this life infinitely precious by making it literally eternal. Rather than seeking salvation in another world, it finds ultimate meaning and value in the exact repetition of this world, with all its imperfections and contradictions. It represents the ultimate affirmation of temporal, physical, finite existence rather than its transcendence or negation. This makes eternal recurrence a fundamentally different type of spiritual doctrine, one that sanctifies the world we actually inhabit rather than directing our attention toward imaginary alternatives. The psychological effects of truly contemplating and accepting eternal recurrence would transform every aspect of human experience. Moments of joy and beauty would become infinitely more precious, knowing that they will return again and again throughout eternity. Moments of pain and difficulty would become more bearable, knowing that they too serve an eternal purpose and contribute to the infinite repetition of one's existence. The artificial distinctions between significant and insignificant events, meaningful and meaningless experiences, would dissolve as everything becomes equally important from the perspective of eternal repetition. Perhaps most importantly, eternal recurrence forces us to confront the question of whether existence itself is good or bad, valuable or worthless, deserving of affirmation or negation. It eliminates all the escape routes and consolations that allow people to avoid taking a definitive stance on this fundamental issue. You cannot love your life conditionally, partially, or with mental reservations if you must live it infinite times exactly as it is. You must either embrace it completely or reject it completely, and your choice reveals your deepest spiritual orientation and your ultimate verdict on the value of human existence. Part 7. Perspectivism and the Critique of Objective Truth. One of Nietzsche's most radical and influential contributions to philosophy involves his systematic critique of traditional concepts of objective truth and absolute knowledge. Through his doctrine of perspectivism, he argued that all human understanding is necessarily limited by the particular viewpoint, interests and circumstances of whoever is doing the understanding. There is no view from nowhere that would allow us to see reality as it truly is, independent of any human perspective. No godlike standpoint from which we could judge different interpretations as objectively correct or incorrect. All knowledge is perspectival knowledge, shaped by the needs, drives and limitations of the creatures who create it. This insight emerged from Nietzsche's deep engagement with both scientific developments and philosophical problems of his era. He witnessed the rapid advancement of natural sciences and their enormous success in predicting and controlling natural phenomena. But he also recognized that scientific knowledge depended on particular assumptions, methods and purposes that were themselves human creations rather than eternal truths. Scientists studying the same phenomena could reach different conclusions depending on their theoretical frameworks, experimental methods, and research interests. Even the most basic scientific concepts like matter, energy, causation, and law seem to be useful human constructions rather than objective features of reality itself. But Nietzsche's perspectivism goes far beyond the philosophy of science to encompass all forms of human understanding, including moral, aesthetic, religious and metaphysical beliefs. When people claim that certain actions are absolutely right or wrong, certain artworks are objectively beautiful or ugly. Certain religious doctrines are literally true or false. They are typically projecting their own limited perspectives onto reality and claiming universal validity for what are actually particular human viewpoints. This does not mean that all perspectives are equally valid or that there are no standards for evaluating different interpretations, but it does mean that these standards themselves reflect human purposes and interests rather than objective features of an independent reality. The question is not which perspective corresponds to the truth, but which perspectives better serve human life, creativity, and flourishing. To understand the full implications of perspectivism, we must recognize how radically it challenges traditional philosophical assumptions about the relationship between mind and reality. Most previous philosophers assumed that the human mind, when functioning properly, could discover eternal truths that exist independently of human thought and experience. They believed that reality has a fixed structure that good thinking can uncover, and that the goal of philosophy and science is to eliminate subjective distortions in order to see things as they really are. Knowledge was valuable precisely because it transcended the limitations of particular perspectives and achieved universal validity. Nietzsche argued that this entire approach rests on a fundamental misconception about the nature of human beings and their relationship to the world around them. Rather than being detached observers who can step outside their own experience to achieve objective knowledge, humans are embedded creatures whose understanding is always shaped by their biological needs, cultural conditioning, and personal history. We do not encounter a neutral, meaningless world that we then describe objectively, but rather we actively interpret and organize our experience according to categories and concepts that serve our particular purposes and interests. Knowledge is not discovery of pre-existing truths, but creation of useful interpretations that enhance our capacity to navigate and transform our environment. This active, creative dimension of human understanding becomes evident when we examine how different individuals and cultures organize the same raw experiences into dramatically different conceptual systems. What one culture considers a single natural phenomenon, another culture might divide into multiple distinct categories with different properties and relationships. What one historical period treats as obvious common sense, another period might reject as primitive superstition or dangerous error. What one individual finds meaningful and significant, another individual might dismiss as trivial or irrelevant. These differences reflect not mere disagreement about objective facts, but fundamental differences in how experience gets organized and interpreted. Perspectivism also helps explain why different people can examine the same evidence and reach radically different conclusions without either party being obviously stupid or dishonest. Their different perspectives lead them to notice different aspects of the evidence, to organize it according to different conceptual frameworks, and to evaluate it according to different criteria of significance and relevance. A religious believer and an atheist examining historical documents about early Christianity are not simply disagreeing about facts, but bringing different fundamental assumptions, interests and purposes to their interpretation of the evidence. A conservative and a liberal analyzing the same economic data are operating from different perspectives about human nature, social organization, and political values that shape what they consider relevant and how they evaluate different outcomes. But perspectivism does not lead to complete relativism, where all viewpoints are considered equally valid, or where there are no grounds for preferring one interpretation over another. Nietzsche consistently argued that some perspectives are more life-enhancing, creative and truthful than others, even if none can claim absolute objectivity. The key is to evaluate perspectives based on their practical consequences for human flourishing, rather than their correspondence to some impossible objective reality. Does a particular way of interpreting experience enhance our capacity for growth, creativity, and meaningful action? Or does it diminish these capacities? Does it promote strength, health, and life affirmation, or does it promote weakness, sickness, and life denial? This pragmatic approach to evaluating different perspectives provides Nietzsche with powerful tools for cultural criticism and individual self-development. Rather than getting trapped in endless debates about which beliefs are objectively true, we can focus on which beliefs better serve human life and creative potential. A moral system can be criticized not because it violates eternal moral laws, but because it systematically undermines human confidence, creativity, and growth. A religious doctrine can be rejected not because it contradicts scientific evidence, but because it promotes weakness, resentment, and life denial among its adherents. An aesthetic theory can be abandoned not because it fails to capture objective beauty, but because it discourages artistic experimentation and creative expression. The implications of perspectivism extend to our understanding of science itself, which Nietzsche saw as one perspective among others rather than a privileged access to objective truth. Science succeeds not because it eliminates human subjectivity, but because it systematically organizes human subjectivity in ways that enhance our power to predict and control natural phenomena. Scientific theories are useful interpretations rather than literal descriptions, valuable tools rather than eternal truths. This does not diminish the achievements of science or make scientific knowledge arbitrary, but it does place science within the broader context of human purposes and interests, rather than treating it as a completely objective enterprise. Perspectivism also has profound implications for how we understand moral and political disagreements. Rather than assuming that one side must be objectively right and the other objectively wrong, we can examine how different moral and political perspectives serve different human types and circumstances. A moral system that works well for strong, independent, creative individuals might be harmful for weak, dependent, conventional individuals and vice versa. A political arrangement that enhances freedom and opportunity for some groups might diminish security and stability for other groups. This does not mean that all moral and political positions are equally valid, but it does mean that evaluation must take into account the particular human needs and circumstances that different perspectives are designed to serve. The psychological aspects of perspectivism reveal how deeply our interpretations of reality are shaped by unconscious drives, emotional attachments, and personal history. We tend to notice and remember information that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring or forgetting information that challenges them, not necessarily because we are dishonest, but because our perspectives are invested in maintaining and expanding themselves. We interpret ambiguous situations in ways that confirm our expectations and support our interests, often without realizing that alternative interpretations are possible or reasonable. We form emotional attachments to ideas and institutions that enhance our sense of meaning and power, while feeling hostile toward those that threaten or diminish us. Understanding these psychological mechanisms can help individuals become more self-aware about their own perspectival limitations and more open to considering alternative viewpoints. Rather than assuming that their initial interpretations are obviously correct, they can learn to recognize the ways in which their own needs, fears, and desires shape their understanding of complex situations. This does not require abandoning their perspectives, but rather holding them more lightly, treating them as useful tools rather than eternal truths. It also opens up possibilities for what Nietzsche called free-spiritedness, the ability to experiment with different perspectives and adopt different viewpoints depending on their usefulness for particular purposes and circumstances. The ultimate significance of perspectivism lies in its potential to liberate human beings from the tyranny of supposedly absolute authorities, while providing new foundations for knowledge, morality, and cultural development. Once we recognize that all human understanding is perspectival, we can stop seeking impossible objective validation for our beliefs and start focusing on creating perspectives that better serve human life and creative potential. We can become more experimental and innovative in our thinking, more tolerant of diversity and disagreement, and more focused on practical consequences rather than abstract principles. Most importantly, we can take responsibility for actively creating our own interpretations of reality rather than passively accepting interpretations handed down by traditional authorities or cultural institutions. Part 8. The Genealogy of Morals, exposing the hidden origins of good and evil. Nietzsche's genealogical method represents one of his most powerful and disturbing techniques for understanding human culture and psychology. Rather than taking moral concepts like good and evil, guilt and innocence, justice and punishment at face value, he traced them back to their historical and psychological origins to reveal the all-too-human interests and drives that created them. This genealogical approach exposes how concepts that claim universal validity and eternal truth actually emerged from particular social circumstances, power relationships, and psychological needs. By understanding how moral systems developed over time, we can better evaluate their continuing usefulness and consider whether new forms of morality might better serve human flourishing in contemporary circumstances. The genealogical method differs fundamentally from traditional approaches to moral philosophy that assume moral concepts refer to objective features of reality or eternal principles discoverable through reason. Instead of asking whether particular moral claims are true or false, Nietzsche asks what psychological and social functions they serve, what types of individuals and cultures they promote or inhibit, and what historical circumstances led to their development and acceptance. He treats moral systems as symptoms of underlying cultural health or sickness, rather than as rational arguments to be evaluated on their logical merits. This approach reveals hidden assumptions and motivations that traditional moral philosophy typically ignores or takes for granted. Nietzsche's most systematic application of genealogical analysis appears in his investigation of the concepts of guilt, bad conscience and punishment that have played such central roles in Christian civilization. He traces these concepts back to their origins in economic relationships between creditors and debtors in primitive societies, where someone who failed to repay a debt literally owed their creditor a piece of their body as compensation. The pain inflicted on debtors who could not pay served both as punishment for their failure and as a form of compensation that gave creditors pleasure roughly equivalent to the material value of what they had lost. This created a psychological association between wrongdoing, suffering, and the restoration of cosmic balance that eventually evolved into more abstract concepts of moral guilt and divine justice. As societies became more complex and sophisticated, these crude economic relationships were transformed into elaborate moral and religious systems, but they retained their underlying psychological structure. The debtor became the sinner, the creditor became God or society, and the physical payment became spiritual punishment that could extend into an eternal afterlife. But the basic logic remained the same. Wrongdoing creates a debt that must be paid through suffering, and this suffering somehow restores the moral order and makes things right again. This explains why Christian civilization has been so obsessed with guilt, punishment, and atonement, treating suffering as spiritually purifying rather than as something to be minimized or eliminated. The genealogical investigation also reveals how the concept of bad conscience or internalized guilt developed as societies required individuals to suppress their natural aggressive and acquisitive instincts in order to live peacefully together. People who could no longer express these instincts outwardly turned them inward against themselves, creating internal psychological conflicts and self-punishment that had never existed in more primitive conditions. What we call conscience is actually the result of natural human drives being blocked from external expression and redirected towards self-criticism and self-hatred. This internalization of aggression made civilization possible, but at enormous psychological cost to individuals who lost touch with their natural vitality and spontaneity. Christianity exploited and intensified these psychological dynamics by teaching people that their natural desires and impulses are inherently sinful and corrupt. Rather than helping individuals integrate their animal and spiritual dimensions, Christian morality created deeper internal conflicts and more intense forms of self-hatred. The result was what Nietzsche called the sick animal, a creature tormented by internal contradictions and unable to achieve genuine happiness or self-acceptance. Christian saints and ascetics represented the extreme development of this sickness, completely turning against life and the body in favor of an imaginary spiritual realm that promised escape from earthly existence. But Nietzsche's genealogical analysis does not lead him to simple condemnation of all moral concepts or to advocacy for a return to primitive conditions. Instead, he recognizes that the development of bad conscience and internalized moral conflict was a necessary stage in human psychological evolution, even though it produced tremendous suffering and spiritual distortion. The same psychological mechanisms that created guilt and self-hatred also created the capacity for self-reflection, self-discipline, and creative self-transformation that distinguish human beings from other animals. The internalization of instincts made possible art, philosophy, religion, and all the highest achievements of human culture, even though it also produced neurosis, depression, and various forms of psychological dysfunction. The key insight is that these psychological developments can be redirected toward healthier and more life-affirming purposes once we understand their origins and mechanisms. Instead of using our capacity for self-reflection to generate guilt and self-hatred, we can use it to achieve greater self-knowledge and self-mastery. Instead of internalizing aggression as self-punishment, we can channel it toward creative self-overcoming and the pursuit of excellence. Instead of treating our natural desires as evil temptations to be suppressed, we can learn to integrate them into a larger vision of human flourishing and creative expression. This genealogical understanding also applies to concepts of justice and punishment that play central roles in legal and political systems throughout the modern world. Nietzsche traces these concepts back to their origins in primitive revenge dynamics, where groups would inflict harm on other groups in retaliation for perceived injuries. The desire for revenge was gradually refined and institutionalized into formal legal systems that promised to restore balance and order through carefully measured punishments administered by neutral authorities. But the underlying psychology remained essentially the same. Wrongdoing generates anger and resentment that can only be satisfied through inflicting suffering on the wrongdoer. This vengeful foundation explains why modern criminal justice systems focus so heavily on punishment rather than rehabilitation or prevention, and why they often seem to generate more problems than they solve. The desire to make criminals suffer often takes precedence over more practical considerations like protecting society, helping victims, or addressing the underlying causes of criminal behavior. The result is systems that satisfy our need for revenge while failing to achieve their ostensible goals of reducing crime and promoting social harmony. Understanding the genealogy of these concepts opens up possibilities for developing more effective and humane approaches to wrongdoing and social conflict. The genealogical method also reveals how concepts of individual responsibility and free will developed to serve specific social and political purposes, rather than to describe objective features of human psychology. The idea that people are fully responsible for their actions and deserve praise or blame based on their choices serves the needs of institutions that want to control behavior through rewards and punishments. But this concept ignores the numerous unconscious factors, genetic predispositions, cultural influences and situational pressures that shape human behavior in ways that individuals rarely recognize or control. The fiction of absolute free will makes punishment seem justified and social control seem legitimate, but it also generates enormous guilt and self-hatred among people who cannot live up to impossible standards of rational self-determination. Nietzsche's analysis of the ascetic ideal provides another powerful example of genealogical thinking applied to seemingly noble and spiritual concepts. He examines the widespread human tendency to devalue earthly existence in favour of otherworldly goals, to suppress bodily desires in favour of spiritual purification, and to seek meaning through self-denial rather than self-affirmation. Rather than taking these ascetic impulses at face value as expressions of genuine spirituality, he traces them to their psychological origins in weakness, resentment, and the inability to create positive meaning and value in ordinary life. The ascetic saint who renounces the world is often motivated not by superior wisdom, but by inability to succeed in worldly pursuits, and by resentment toward those who can enjoy life without guilt or conflict. This genealogical understanding does not necessarily invalidate all forms of self-discipline or spiritual practice, but it does reveal the hidden motivations and psychological dynamics that often underlie them. Some forms of asceticism might serve healthy purposes like developing self-control, clarifying priorities, or preparing for creative work that requires intense focus and dedication. But other forms clearly serve unhealthy purposes like avoiding responsibility, escaping from difficult challenges, or expressing hatred toward life and the body. The genealogical method helps distinguish between these different types and motivations rather than assuming that all self-denial is equally spiritual or admirable. The ultimate goal of genealogical analysis is not to destroy all existing values and institutions, but to create space for new and better ones by exposing the contingent and often questionable origins of what we currently take for granted. Once we understand how our moral concepts developed and what functions they serve, we can begin to imagine alternatives that might better serve human flourishing and creative potential. We can retain those aspects of traditional morality that enhance life while discarding or transforming those aspects that diminish it. Most importantly, we can take conscious responsibility for creating new values rather than simply inheriting them from the past or accepting them on the authority of tradition. Part 9. Art, Aesthetics, and the Tragic Vision of Life. Throughout his philosophical career, Nietzsche maintained that art represents the highest form of human creativity and the most powerful antidote to the nihilistic despair that threatens modern civilization. Unlike religion, which seeks escape from the world into an imaginary transcendent realm, and unlike science, which reduces the world to abstract mathematical relationships, art celebrates the immediate sensuous reality of human experience while transforming it into forms of beauty and meaning. Great art faces the full horror and absurdity of existence without flinching, while simultaneously creating something so beautiful and powerful that it makes existence seem worthwhile despite its terrible aspects. This capacity to affirm life through aesthetic creation rather than through conceptual argument or religious consolation makes art uniquely valuable for overcoming nihilism and creating new forms of meaning in a godless universe. Nietzsche's understanding of art was profoundly influenced by his early encounter with the tragedies of ancient Greece, particularly the works of Aeschylus and Sophocles. He recognized that Greek tragedy achieved something unprecedented in human culture by presenting the most terrible stories of human suffering and cosmic injustice within perfectly crafted dramatic forms that were simultaneously horrifying and beautiful. Audiences watching these plays experienced both the full impact of life's cruelty and meaninglessness, and the transcendent joy that comes from witnessing artistic mastery and aesthetic perfection. This combination allowed them to affirm existence completely without requiring false consolations or metaphysical explanations that would diminish the reality of suffering. To understand how this aesthetic affirmation works, Nietzsche developed his famous distinction between two artistic drives that he associated with the Greek gods Apollo and Dionysus. The Apollonian drive represents the human need for order, clarity, individuation, and beautiful appearances that give shape and meaning to chaotic experience. It creates perfect forms, harmonious structures, and ideal representations that allow us to contemplate reality without being overwhelmed by its complexity and contradiction. Apollonian art includes sculpture, epic poetry, and the visual arts that present clear images of human excellence and divine beauty. The Dionysian drive, by contrast, represents the human need for ecstasy, intoxication, unity, and the dissolution of individual boundaries that separate us from the vital forces of life itself. It expresses the wild creative energy that underlies all existence, the chaotic will to power that constantly creates and destroys forms without regard for individual preferences or moral considerations. Dionysian art includes music, dance, and lyric poetry that transport us beyond ordinary consciousness into states of mystical union with the fundamental processes of becoming and transformation. Rather than creating beautiful objects for contemplation, Dionysian art creates experiences of participation in the creative and destructive forces of existence itself. Neither artistic drive by itself can produce the highest forms of art or provide adequate responses to the human condition. Pure Apollonian art becomes cold, static, and removed from life, creating beautiful but lifeless forms that fail to engage our deepest emotions and most vital energies. Pure Dionysian art becomes chaotic, destructive, and ultimately meaningless, overwhelming individuals with experiences too intense and formless to be integrated into coherent human understanding. The greatest art emerges from the creative tension between these drives, combining Apollonian form with Dionysian energy to create works that are both perfectly structured and vitally alive. Greek tragedy represents the supreme achievement of this artistic synthesis. The terrible stories of fate, suffering and death provide the Dionysian content that forces audiences to confront the most disturbing aspects of human existence. But these stories are presented within perfectly crafted dramatic structures that represent the highest development of Apollonian artistic skill and vision. The result is an aesthetic experience that allows audiences to face ultimate questions about the meaning and value of existence without being destroyed by despair or forced to seek refuge in comforting illusions. The chorus in Greek tragedy plays a particularly important role in mediating between these Dionysian and Apollonian elements. Through music, dance, and collective singing, the chorus expresses the emotional and mystical dimensions of the dramatic action, while also providing commentary and interpretation that helps audiences understand its significance. The chorus represents the voice of the community responding to individual suffering and cosmic injustice, neither denying the reality of these experiences nor being overwhelmed by them. Instead, it transforms raw suffering into shared aesthetic experience that affirms the value of human existence even in its most tragic aspects. Nietzsche argued that modern culture had lost this capacity for tragic art and aesthetic life affirmation. Christianity had made people suspicious of sensuous beauty and artistic creation, teaching them to value spiritual purity over aesthetic excellence and moral goodness over creative power. The scientific worldview had reduced reality to mechanical processes governed by mathematical laws, eliminating the sense of mystery and wonder that makes great art possible. Democratic egalitarianism had promoted the interests of the masses over the cultivation of exceptional individuals who create lasting works of beauty and significance. The result was what Nietzsche called the decline of art into entertainment, propaganda, or mere decoration rather than the profound cultural force it had been in healthier civilizations. Modern artists often focused on expressing their personal emotions or promoting social and political causes rather than creating works of enduring beauty and universal significance. Audiences approached art as a form of escape or amusement rather than as a serious engagement with ultimate questions about the nature and meaning of existence. The very possibility of art serving as a genuine alternative to religion and philosophy as a source of meaning and value seemed to be disappearing from European culture. But Nietzsche also saw tremendous potential for artistic renewal and cultural regeneration if the right conditions could be created. The death of God and the collapse of traditional meaning systems opened up unprecedented possibilities for aesthetic creation and individual self-transformation. Artists who were no longer constrained by religious dogmas or conventional moral expectations could explore new forms of beauty and expression that had never existed before. Individuals who had lost faith in external authorities could learn to create their own lives as works of art, applying aesthetic principles to personal development and self-realization. This leads to one of Nietzsche's most important and challenging ideas, the conception of one's own life as an aesthetic project rather than a moral or religious one. Instead of asking whether their choices are morally right or spiritually pure, individuals could ask whether they are creating something beautiful, powerful, and worthy of admiration. Instead of conforming to external standards of goodness or truth, they could develop their own distinctive style and vision that expresses their unique perspective and creative potential. Instead of seeking salvation in another world, they could focus on creating meaning and value in this world through their own actions and achievements. This aesthetic approach to self-creation requires tremendous sophistication and cultural refinement. Just as great artists must master traditional techniques before they can create innovative works, individuals must understand existing moral, philosophical and cultural traditions before they can transcend them in healthy and creative ways. The aesthetic life is not an excuse for self-indulgence or moral irresponsibility, but a higher form of discipline that demands even greater self-knowledge and self-control than traditional moral approaches. The person who successfully creates their life as a work of art must be simultaneously their own raw material, their own sculptor and their own critic, taking complete responsibility for the final result. Nietzsche also recognized that this aesthetic approach to life could easily degenerate into mere aestheticism or superficial concern with appearances rather than genuine depth and significance. The truly aesthetic life must combine surface beauty with profound substance, elegant form with vital content, individual style with universal relevance. It requires not just artistic sensitivity, but also philosophical insight, psychological self-knowledge, and the courage to face difficult truths about oneself and the world. The aesthetic creator must be willing to suffer and struggle in order to transform their raw experience into something worthy of eternal affirmation and infinite repetition. The social and political implications of Nietzsche's aesthetic philosophy are complex and often misunderstood. He did not advocate for a society ruled by artists or for the subordination of moral and political concerns to aesthetic ones. Rather, he hoped that individuals who had learned to create their own lives aesthetically would also contribute to the creation of a more beautiful and excellent culture that could serve as the foundation for higher forms of human achievement. A society composed of such individuals would naturally produce better art, philosophy, science and politics without requiring explicit coordination or central planning. The ultimate significance of Nietzsche's aesthetic philosophy lies in its potential to provide new sources of meaning and motivation for individuals who can no longer believe in traditional religious or moral authorities. By learning to see life as an artistic project and themselves as creative artists, people can find reasons to strive for excellence and create lasting value even in a universe that provides no external validation or cosmic purpose. The joy that comes from successful artistic creation can replace the satisfaction that previous generations found in moral righteousness or religious salvation. The pursuit of beauty and individual perfection can provide direction and meaning for lives that might otherwise sink into nihilistic despair or shallow hedonism. Part 10. The Transvaluation of All Values, Creating New Foundations for Human Culture. The transvaluation of all values represents Nietzsche's most ambitious and revolutionary philosophical project, nothing less than the systematic re-examination and transformation of every moral, cultural and spiritual assumption that has guided Western civilization for over 2,000 years. This is not simply a matter of rejecting existing values or promoting moral relativism, but rather a fundamental reconstruction of the basis upon which human beings create meaning, establish purposes, and organize their individual and collective lives. Nietzsche recognized that the collapse of traditional religious and metaphysical foundations created both a crisis and an unprecedented opportunity for humanity to consciously create new forms of value that could better serve human flourishing and creative potential in the modern world. The transvaluation requires nothing less than becoming legislators of new forms of human excellence and architects of post-Christian civilization. The necessity for transvaluation arises directly from Nietzsche's analysis of the death of God and the nihilistic crisis facing European culture. When traditional sources of meaning and authority collapse, people typically respond either by desperately clinging to the old values despite their loss of credibility, or by concluding that no values have any validity at all. Both responses represent forms of spiritual sickness that prevent healthy cultural development and individual growth. The first response leads to hypocrisy, self-deception, and the gradual decay of institutions that no longer inspire genuine belief or commitment. The second response leads to cynicism, despair, and the inability to create anything positive or constructive to replace what has been lost. The transvaluation offers a third alternative that moves beyond both desperate conservatism and destructive nihilism. Instead of trying to preserve values that have lost their foundation or abandoning the very possibility of value creation, exceptional individuals can take responsibility for creating new values based on a deeper understanding of human nature and cultural development. This requires what Nietzsche called a philosophizing with a hammer, systematically testing existing values to see which ones still ring true and which ones have become hollow shells that need to be discarded. Those values that enhance human life, promote creativity, and encourage the development of excellence can be retained and refined, while those that diminish life, discourage creativity, and promote mediocrity must be abandoned regardless of their traditional authority or popular acceptance. The process of transvaluation begins with what Nietzsche described as the most difficult and dangerous task, learning to think beyond good and evil as traditionally understood. This does not mean abandoning all moral distinctions or embracing moral relativism, but rather questioning the particular forms that moral thinking has taken in Christian civilization. The traditional categories of good and evil, sin and virtue, sacred and profane, reflect specific historical circumstances and psychological needs that may no longer be relevant or helpful for contemporary human development. By stepping outside these inherited categories, individuals can begin to develop new forms of moral evaluation based on more fundamental criteria, like the enhancement or diminishment of life, the promotion or inhibition of human excellence, and the creation or destruction of meaning and beauty. This process requires extraordinary intellectual courage and psychological strength because it means abandoning the security and guidance provided by traditional moral authorities. Most people prefer to follow established rules and conventional expectations rather than taking full responsibility for creating their own standards of value and meaning. The comfort of knowing that one is following a path sanctioned by God, tradition, or social consensus provides psychological security that few individuals are willing to sacrifice. But Nietzsche argued that this security comes at the cost of authenticity, creativity, and the possibility of genuine human greatness. Only those rare individuals who can tolerate the anxiety and uncertainty of moral autonomy are capable of participating in the transvaluation of values. The transvaluation also requires a sophisticated understanding of the psychological and cultural functions that different values serve. Rather than simply rejecting values because they seem outdated or irrational, the transvaluator must understand why they emerged, what needs they satisfied, and what would be lost if they were simply eliminated without replacement. Even values that seem clearly harmful or destructive may serve important psychological functions for certain types of individuals or social circumstances. The challenge is to create new values that can serve these legitimate functions more effectively while eliminating the harmful side effects of traditional approaches. For example, traditional Christian virtues like humility, self-sacrifice and compassion serve real human needs for social cooperation, mutual support, and the mitigation of suffering. But the Christian interpretation of these virtues often promotes weakness, resentment, and life denial rather than genuine strength and life affirmation. The transvaluation would not simply reject these virtues, but would reinterpret them in ways that enhance, rather than diminish, human vitality and creative potential. True compassion might be understood as the strength to help others become more excellent and self-reliant rather than the weakness that enables dependency and mediocrity. Genuine humility might be seen as accurate self-assessment and openness to growth rather than self-hatred and the denial of one's own capacities and achievements. The creation of new values cannot be accomplished through abstract reasoning alone, but requires what Nietzsche called experimentation with living. Individuals must actually attempt to live according to new principles and evaluate their effects on personal development, relationships, and creative accomplishment. This experimental approach treats values as hypotheses to be tested through experience rather than as eternal truths to be accepted on faith. Those values that consistently produce growth, excellence, and life affirmation in practice demonstrate their validity regardless of their theoretical justification or traditional authority. Those that consistently produce stagnation, mediocrity, and life denial reveal their inadequacy regardless of their logical consistency or popular acceptance. The transvaluation must also address the social and political dimensions of value creation rather than remaining purely individual and personal. While exceptional individuals may be capable of creating their own values through personal experimentation and philosophical reflection, most people need cultural institutions and social environments that support and encourage healthy value development. This raises complex questions about how new values can be transmitted, institutionalized, and made accessible to broader populations without being corrupted or diluted in the process. Nietzsche recognized that creating new values is only the first step. Implementing them effectively throughout a culture requires additional forms of wisdom and practical skill that few philosophers possess. One of the most challenging aspects of the Transvaluation involves determining what should replace the Christian emphasis on equality, universal compassion, and the inherent dignity of all human beings. While Nietzsche criticized these ideals as expressions of slave morality that discourage excellence and promote mediocrity, he also recognized that some form of social cooperation and mutual concern is necessary for any viable human culture. The challenge is to develop new forms of social organization that can promote both individual excellence and collective flourishing, without falling into either aristocratic oppression or democratic leveling. This might require new concepts of justice, authority, and social responsibility that have never existed before in human history. The Transvaluation also must address the relationship between individual self-creation and cultural tradition. While Nietzsche emphasized the importance of moving beyond inherited values and creating new ones, he also recognized that cultural traditions contain accumulated wisdom and tested insights that should not be discarded carelessly. The most sophisticated transvaluators would be those who thoroughly understand existing traditions and can build upon their strengths while eliminating their weaknesses. This requires what Nietzsche called historical sense, the ability to understand how current values emerged from past circumstances and to envision how they might be transformed to meet future challenges and opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, the transvaluation of values must be guided by a clear vision of what human beings might become if they were freed from the constraints and distortions of traditional moral systems. This is where Nietzsche's concepts of the overman and eternal recurrence become crucial, providing both inspiration and practical criteria for evaluating new values. Values that promote the development of overhuman capacities and encourage the kind of life affirmation expressed in joyful acceptance of eternal recurrence demonstrate their worth through their effects on human development. Values that discourage such development or promote life denial reveal their inadequacy regardless of their traditional authority or theoretical justification. The ultimate goal of the Transvaluation is not to create a new dogmatic system that would simply replace Christianity with another form of rigid orthodoxy. Instead, it aims to establish principles and methods for ongoing value creation that can adapt to changing circumstances and continue to promote human excellence across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The Transvaluation should make human beings more capable of creating their own meaning and purpose rather than more dependent on external authorities for guidance and validation. It should enhance human creativity and flexibility rather than constraining them within new forms of conventional thinking and behavior. In this sense, the Transvaluation of all values represents not just a philosophical project, but a fundamental transformation in what it means to be human. Part 11. The Critique of Christianity Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche's sustained critique of Christianity goes far deeper than the typical atheistic arguments of his era, penetrating to the very psychological and cultural roots of Christian civilization to expose what he saw as a systematic poisoning of human vitality and creative potential. Rather than simply arguing that Christian doctrines are factually incorrect or that religious authorities are hypocritical, he diagnosed Christianity as a form of spiritual sickness that had infected Western culture with life-denying values and self-destructive attitudes. His analysis reveals how Christian morality, despite its apparent emphasis on love and compassion, actually promotes resentment, weakness, and the hatred of life itself. This critique is essential for understanding why Nietzsche considered the death of God both a catastrophe and an unprecedented opportunity for human development and cultural renewal. The historical origins of Christianity provide crucial insight into its psychological and moral character. Nietzsche argued that Christianity emerged from the specific circumstances of Jewish cultural resistance to Roman political and cultural domination. Unable to compete with their conquerors in terms of military power, political organization, or cultural achievement, the Jews created a religious system that inverted traditional values and made virtues out of their weaknesses. Poverty became blessed, suffering became redemptive, and meekness became holy, allowing them to feel spiritually superior to their oppressors while remaining politically powerless. This represented what Nietzsche called the most successful slave revolt in human history, not a violent overthrow of existing authorities, but a subtle psychological transformation that gradually undermined their confidence and legitimacy. Christianity universalized this resentful morality by extending it beyond its original ethnic and cultural boundaries to encompass all of humanity. The Christian message that all people are equal in the sight of God and that earthly hierarchies will be reversed in the afterlife appealed powerfully to slaves, women, and other oppressed groups throughout the Roman Empire. But it also attracted members of the ruling classes who had become spiritually exhausted and psychologically weakened by their own success and power. The Christian promise of redemption from sin offered relief from the guilt and meaninglessness that plagued late Roman civilization, even though this relief came at the cost of vitality and creative energy. The psychological mechanisms underlying Christian morality reveal its fundamentally reactive and life-denying character. Rather than celebrating what Christians love and affirm, Christian morality defines itself primarily through opposition to what it hates and condemns. The 7 deadly sins of pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth represent precisely those natural human drives and desires that produce energy, ambition, and creative accomplishment. By teaching people to feel guilty about their most vital impulses, Christianity creates internal conflicts that make genuine happiness and self-acceptance nearly impossible. The result is what Nietzsche called the sick animal, a creature torn apart by contradictory demands and unable to achieve integration or wholeness. The Christian emphasis on otherworldly salvation represents perhaps the most damaging aspect of this religious system. By promising eternal life in heaven as compensation for earthly suffering and self-denial, Christianity systematically devalues the only existence that human beings actually possess. Everything that makes life worth living, including beauty, pleasure, achievement, love, and creative expression, becomes either sinful temptation or mere preparation for a supposedly higher spiritual reality. This otherworldly orientation prevents people from investing their full energy and attention in developing their actual capacities and creating genuine meaning in their present circumstances. They become spiritual tourists in their own lives, always looking ahead to an imaginary destination rather than engaging fully with their immediate experience. The concept of original sin provides another revealing example of Christianity's psychological toxicity. By teaching that all human beings are born corrupted and deserving of eternal punishment, Christianity ensures that people will never achieve genuine self-acceptance or confidence in their own nature and capabilities. Even the most moral and accomplished individuals must constantly struggle against their supposedly inherent wickedness and depend on divine grace for any hope of salvation. This creates a permanent state of psychological dependency and self-hatred that serves the interests of religious authorities but undermines individual autonomy and creative development. People learn to distrust their own judgments, suppress their own desires, and seek validation from external authorities rather than developing their own capacity for wisdom and self-direction. The Christian virtue of humility illustrates how supposedly noble moral concepts can actually promote weakness and mediocrity when properly analyzed. Traditional humility involves the systematic underestimation of one's own abilities and achievements combined with exaggerated respect for external authorities and conventional opinions. While this attitude may promote social harmony and reduce conflict in certain circumstances, it also discourages individual excellence and creative innovation. People who have been taught to be humble rarely develop their talents to the fullest extent or challenge existing beliefs and institutions that need to be reformed or replaced. They become passive followers rather than active creators, consumers of existing culture rather than producers of new possibilities. Similarly, the Christian emphasis on self-sacrifice and service to others can become a form of sophisticated self-hatred that masquerades as moral nobility. People who cannot find meaning or value in their own lives may seek validation through constantly helping others, but this compulsive altruism often serves their own psychological needs rather than genuinely benefiting those they claim to serve. Moreover, it prevents them from developing their own capacities and pursuing their own legitimate goals and interests. The result is often resentment toward those they help and a subtle form of manipulation that makes others dependent on their assistance rather than encouraging genuine autonomy and self-development. The institutional aspects of Christianity compound these psychological problems by creating systematic forms of exploitation and control. Priestly classes benefit from maintaining popular belief in doctrines that promote guilt, dependency, and otherworldly orientation, since these beliefs increase demand for religious services and support clerical authority. The more guilty and helpless people feel, the more they need priestly intercession and guidance, creating economic and political incentives for religious leaders to promote psychological dysfunction rather than health and independence. This explains why Christian institutions have historically resisted scientific advancement, philosophical inquiry, and cultural developments that might reduce popular dependence on religious authority. Nietzsche also criticized the Christian concept of universal love or agape as both psychologically impossible and morally corrupting. Genuine love requires selectivity, preference, and the recognition of genuine differences in value and worth between different individuals and groups. The command to love everyone equally makes love meaningless by eliminating the discrimination and judgment that give emotional attachments their significance and power. Moreover, universal love often serves as a cover for the inability to form deep, committed relationships with particular individuals who deserve special attention and care. People who claim to love all humanity often reveal their incapacity for genuine intimacy and passionate attachment to specific persons who could make real claims on their time, energy, and resources. The Christian promise of divine justice in the afterlife represents another form of psychological poison that prevents people from taking effective action to address injustice and suffering in their actual circumstances. Rather than working to create better conditions in this world, believers console themselves with fantasies of cosmic revenge, where the wicked will be punished and the righteous rewarded according to perfect divine judgment. This otherworldly hope serves the interests of existing power structures by discouraging rebellion and reform while providing emotional satisfaction that reduces motivation for practical action. The result is often the perpetuation of precisely those conditions that generate the need for consolation and compensation in an imaginary future life. However, Nietzsche's critique of Christianity is not simply negative or destructive, but aims to clear the ground for healthier and more life-affirming forms of spiritual development. He recognized that Christianity had served certain important functions in European cultural development, particularly in refining psychological sophistication and creating capacities for self-reflection and self-discipline that had not existed in pre-Christian civilization. The problem was not that these capacities had been developed, but that they had been misdirected toward life-denying rather than life-affirming purposes. The same psychological mechanisms that Christianity used to generate guilt and self-hatred could potentially be redirected toward genuine self-knowledge and creative self-transformation. This analysis leads to Nietzsche's vision of what he called higher men, or free spirits who could move beyond Christianity while retaining its psychological insights and cultural achievements. These individuals would combine the sophistication and depth of Christian introspection with the life-affirming values and creative energy of pre-Christian aristocratic culture. They would be simultaneously more psychologically complex than ancient pagans and more vitally engaged with life than traditional Christians. Their spirituality would be based on love of this world rather than hope for another world, on the development of human potential rather than submission to divine will, and on the creation of meaning through action rather than the acceptance of meaning through faith. The ultimate significance of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity lies in its potential to liberate human beings from systematic forms of self-hatred and life-denial that have prevented the full development of human capacities for over 2 millennia. By understanding how Christian morality operates psychologically and culturally, individuals can begin to free themselves from its influence and create healthier forms of spiritual life that enhance rather than diminish their vitality and creative potential. This liberation is not automatic or easy, but requires sustained intellectual effort and psychological work to identify and overcome the deeply ingrained patterns of thought and feeling that Christianity has embedded in Western culture. But for those capable of such work, the rewards include not only personal freedom and authenticity, but also the possibility of contributing to a cultural renaissance that could surpass even the greatest achievements of the past. Part 12. Free Spirits and Philosophers of the Future. The concept of free spirits represents Nietzsche's vision of a new type of human being who could emerge from the ruins of traditional religious and moral authorities to create unprecedented forms of knowledge, culture, and individual excellence. These exceptional individuals would combine intellectual independence with psychological strength, creative originality with cultural sophistication, and radical autonomy with deep responsibility for the future of human development. They would serve as bridges between the dying Christian civilization and whatever post-religious culture might eventually replace it, pioneering new ways of thinking and living that could guide humanity through the dangerous transition period ahead. The free spirit represents neither a return to pre-Christian paganism nor a continuation of Christian values, but something entirely new that transcends both while learning from their achievements and limitations. The development of free-spiritedness requires what Nietzsche called a process of spiritual emancipation that goes far deeper than simple intellectual disagreement with traditional beliefs. Most people who consider themselves free thinkers or nonconformists have merely replaced one set of external authorities with another, substituting scientific materialism for religious dogma or progressive political ideology for conservative moral tradition. They remain psychologically dependent on group membership and social validation even when they rebel against particular groups or societies. The genuine free spirit, by contrast, has learned to generate his own standards of truth, value and meaning from within, rather than seeking them from any external source. This internal authority is not arbitrary or subjective, but emerges from rigorous self-knowledge and systematic experimentation with different ways of understanding and evaluating experience. The free spirit has tested various philosophical, moral and cultural perspectives against the criteria of their practical effects on human flourishing and creative development. He has learned to distinguish between those beliefs and practices that enhance life and those that diminish it, regardless of their traditional authority or popular acceptance. This process requires tremendous intellectual honesty and the courage to abandon cherished beliefs when they prove inadequate or harmful, even when such abandonment creates temporary confusion or social isolation. The psychological characteristics of free spirits distinguish them sharply from both conventional believers and typical skeptics or rebels. They possess what Nietzsche called intellectual probity, the commitment to truth and honesty, even when such commitment leads to uncomfortable or inconvenient conclusions. Unlike believers, they refuse to accept ideas simply because they are traditional, authoritative, or emotionally satisfying. But unlike mere skeptics, they also refuse to reject ideas simply because they challenge conventional assumptions or scientific orthodoxies. They evaluate all claims based on evidence and reasoning, while recognizing that evidence and reasoning themselves are shaped by human purposes and perspectives. Free spirits also display remarkable psychological resilience and adaptability in the face of uncertainty and change. Rather than clinging desperately to fixed beliefs or identities when circumstances change, they maintain what Nietzsche called experimental attitudes toward themselves and their environment. They treat their current beliefs and values as hypotheses to be tested rather than as permanent truths to be defended, and they remain open to revising or abandoning these beliefs when new evidence or experiences suggest better alternatives. This experimental approach extends to their personal lives as well, where they continuously work to refine and develop their character, relationships, and creative projects without being constrained by past commitments that no longer serve their purposes. The social position of free spirits creates both opportunities and challenges that ordinary people rarely experience. Their independence from conventional authorities and popular opinions allows them to see cultural and social phenomena with unusual clarity and objectivity. They can recognize patterns, problems, and possibilities that remain invisible to people who are embedded within particular traditions or ideological systems. But this same independence can also create isolation and misunderstanding, since their insights often threaten established interests and challenge comfortable assumptions. Free spirits must learn to communicate their discoveries in ways that can be heard and understood by others without compromising their intellectual integrity or diluting their message beyond recognition. The relationship between free spirits and existing cultural institutions represents one of the most complex aspects of their social situation. They cannot simply reject all existing institutions and traditions, since they need cultural resources and social support to accomplish their creative work. But they also cannot accept these institutions uncritically, since many of them embody values and assumptions that free spirits have learned to question or reject. The solution requires what Nietzsche called strategic thinking, the ability to work within existing systems while gradually transforming them in healthier directions. This might involve using traditional languages and concepts to communicate new ideas, or working through established organizations to promote reforms that prepare the ground for more fundamental changes. The educational and developmental path toward free-spiritedness cannot be systematized or institutionalized in the way that traditional forms of education can be. Each individual must find his own way through the psychological and intellectual challenges involved in achieving genuine autonomy and creative independence. However, Nietzsche did identify certain experiences and practices that tend to promote free-spiritedness in those who are capable of such development. These include extensive travel and exposure to different cultures, serious engagement with multiple philosophical and scientific traditions, creative work in art or literature, and sustained periods of solitude for self-reflection and experimentation. The intellectual methods employed by free spirits differ significantly from those used in traditional academic philosophy or scientific research. Rather than specializing in narrow technical areas or following established methodological procedures, free spirits cultivate what Nietzsche called philosophical versatility and intellectual range. They draw insights from multiple disciplines and perspectives, combining logical analysis with psychological observation, historical research with personal experimentation, scientific study with artistic creation. This interdisciplinary approach allows them to see connections and possibilities that specialists often miss, but it also requires exceptional intellectual capacity and years of diverse learning and experience. The creative contributions of free spirits to human culture tend to be both revolutionary and integrative, challenging existing assumptions while synthesizing insights from various sources into new coherent visions, unlike mere critics or rebels who only tear down what exists. Free spirits combine destructive and constructive capacities, clearing away obsolete ideas and institutions while building new ones that can better serve human needs and possibilities. Their works often appear strange or incomprehensible to contemporary audiences, but gradually gain recognition as their insights prove their value through practical application and cultural influence. They serve as cultural pioneers who explore new territories of human possibility and create maps that others can follow. Nietzsche distinguished between free spirits and what he called philosophers of the future, though the two concepts overlap in important ways. While free spirits represent individuals who have achieved personal autonomy and independence from traditional authorities, philosophers of the future represent a new type of intellectual leader who can guide cultural development and create new forms of value for entire civilizations. These future philosophers would combine the personal qualities of free spirits with additional capacities for cultural leadership, practical wisdom, and the creation of institutions that could perpetuate and extend their insights beyond their individual lifespans. They would be simultaneously thinkers and doers, theorists and practitioners, individuals and social forces. The emergence of philosophers of the future depends on cultural conditions that do not currently exist but might develop as the nihilistic crisis of modernity deepens and more people recognize the need for fundamental cultural reconstruction. These conditions would include greater general education and cultural sophistication, increased tolerance for intellectual diversity and experimentation, and social institutions that could support and reward creative excellence rather than conformity and mediocrity. Most importantly, there would need to be widespread recognition that the old authorities and traditions can no longer provide adequate guidance for contemporary challenges and opportunities. Only when enough people acknowledge the bankruptcy of existing cultural resources will they become receptive to the radical innovations that philosophers of the future might offer. The practical tasks facing philosophers of the future include creating new educational methods that can develop human potential more effectively than current approaches, designing social and political institutions that can balance individual excellence with collective flourishing, and establishing cultural practices that can transmit wisdom across generations without stifling innovation and creativity. These are enormously complex challenges that require both theoretical insight and practical skill, both visionary imagination and realistic assessment of human limitations and possibilities. They cannot be solved by individuals working in isolation, but will require collaboration among multiple free spirits and philosophers who can combine their different talents and perspectives. The future of human culture may depend on whether such collaboration becomes possible and effective in addressing the fundamental problems of post-religious civilization. The ultimate significance of free spirits and philosophers of the future lies in their potential to demonstrate that human beings can create their own meaning, authority, and excellence without depending on external gods, traditions, or ideologies. By achieving genuine autonomy and creative independence, they prove that the death of God need not lead to nihilistic despair, but can become the foundation for unprecedented forms of human flourishing and cultural achievement. They serve as living examples of what individuals might become if they have the courage to embrace radical freedom and take full responsibility for their own development and the future of human civilization. Their existence offers hope that humanity can successfully navigate the dangerous transition from traditional religious culture to whatever post-traditional possibilities await discovery and creation. Part 13. The Critique of Modern Democracy and Mass Culture. Nietzsche's analysis of modern democratic society and mass culture reveals profound concerns about the direction of Western civilization that extend far beyond simple political preferences or class interests. He saw democracy not as a neutral political system that could be evaluated based on its practical effectiveness, but as the political expression of deeper cultural and spiritual trends that threatened to undermine the conditions necessary for human excellence and creative achievement. The democratic emphasis on equality, majority rule, and the satisfaction of popular desires represented for Nietzsche a systematic levelling process that would reduce all human beings to the lowest common denominator and eliminate the aristocratic conditions that had produced the greatest achievements in art, philosophy, science, and culture throughout human history. This critique is essential for understanding his vision of what must be preserved or recreated if humanity is to avoid spiritual mediocrity and cultural decay. The psychological foundations of democratic ideology reflect what Nietzsche identified as the triumph of slave morality on a massive social and political scale. The democratic belief that all people possess equal dignity and deserve equal political influence regardless of their abilities, achievements, or contributions to society represents the political institutionalization of resentment against excellence and distinction. Rather than inspiring people to develop their own capacities and strive for personal greatness, democratic equality encourages them to demand that others be reduced to their level and to view superior achievement as a form of injustice that should be corrected through political action. This creates systematic incentives for mediocrity and conformity while penalizing the exceptional individuals whose innovations and insights have driven human progress throughout history. The practical effects of democratic politics on cultural development are particularly damaging according to Nietzsche's analysis. Political leaders in democratic systems must appeal to the preferences and prejudices of mass audiences who typically lack the education, sophistication, and long-term perspective necessary for wise governance. This forces politicians to adopt populist rhetoric and policies that may satisfy immediate popular demands, but undermine the foundations of cultural excellence and social health. Complex problems that require unpopular solutions or long-term thinking are either ignored or addressed through superficial measures that make the underlying problems worse while appearing to address public concerns. The democratic process of majority rule embodies what Nietzsche saw as a fundamental confusion about the relationship between quantity and quality in human affairs. The fact that more people believe something or prefer something does not make it more true, more valuable, or more conducive to human flourishing than alternatives that may be understood and appreciated only by smaller numbers of more perceptive individuals. In many cases, the most important truths and values are initially recognized by very few people and only gradually gain broader acceptance as their practical benefits become obvious. Democratic systems systematically disadvantage such minority insights and innovations while privileging popular opinions that may be based on ignorance, prejudice, or short-term self-interest rather than genuine wisdom and understanding. The emergence of mass culture represents another aspect of democratization that Nietzsche found deeply troubling. When cultural production is oriented primarily toward satisfying the tastes and preferences of large anonymous audiences, it inevitably becomes simplified, sensationalized, and standardized in ways that eliminate the subtlety, complexity, and originality that characterize great art and literature. Artists and writers must appeal to the lowest common denominator of popular taste rather than developing their distinctive visions and challenging their audiences to grow and develop more sophisticated forms of appreciation. The result is cultural products that provide immediate entertainment and emotional satisfaction, but fail to educate, inspire, or elevate their consumers toward higher forms of understanding and experience. The economic foundations of democratic capitalism compound these cultural problems by treating all forms of value as commodities that can be bought and sold in competitive markets. This economic logic reduces art, education, religion, and even personal relationships to their exchange value rather than recognizing their intrinsic worth and unique contributions to human development. Cultural activities that cannot generate profits or attract large paying audiences are systematically underfunded and marginalized, regardless of their importance for maintaining civilizational standards and creating conditions for exceptional achievement. The market rewards what is popular and profitable rather than what is excellent and valuable, creating systematic distortions in cultural development and resource allocation. The psychological effects of democratic mass culture on individual development are equally concerning from Nietzsche's perspective. People who are constantly exposed to democratic ideologies and mass cultural products learn to think of themselves primarily as members of groups rather than as unique individuals with distinctive capacities and potential for personal excellence. They seek validation through conformity to popular trends rather than through the development of their own talents and the pursuit of personal goals that might distinguish them from their peers. This collective orientation undermines the self-reliance, independent judgment, and creative originality that exceptional individuals need to make significant contributions to human knowledge and culture. The democratic emphasis on rights and entitlements rather than duties and responsibilities reflects what Nietzsche saw as a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between individual freedom and social order. When people focus primarily on what they can demand from society rather than what they can contribute to it, They develop parasitic attitudes that undermine the productive and creative activities upon which civilization depends. True freedom requires not just the absence of external constraints, but the presence of internal discipline and the capacity for self-directed action toward worthwhile goals. Democratic rights without corresponding virtues and capabilities lead to license rather than liberty, and ultimately destroy the conditions that make genuine freedom possible. The educational implications of democratic ideology are particularly troubling because they affect the development of future generations and the transmission of cultural knowledge and values. Democratic educational systems typically emphasize equality of outcomes rather than excellence of achievement, standardizing curricula and methods in ways that prevent the identification and development of exceptional talents. Students learn to value social acceptance and group membership over intellectual achievement and personal distinction, preparing them for lives of conformity rather than creativity and leadership. The result is systematic underdevelopment of human potential and the gradual decline of cultural standards as each generation becomes less capable than the previous one of maintaining and extending civilizational achievements. However, Nietzsche's critique of democracy should not be interpreted as advocacy for traditional forms of aristocracy or authoritarianism that merely replace democratic oppression with aristocratic oppression. His vision of healthy cultural hierarchy is based on achievement and excellence rather than inherited privilege or political power. The aristocrats he admired were those who had earned their position through personal accomplishment and who used their advantages to create cultural works and institutions that benefited not only themselves but future generations. Such natural aristocracy emerges organically from the free development of human talents rather than being imposed through political force or social convention. The alternative to both democratic levelling and traditional aristocratic oppression would be what Nietzsche envisioned as a cultural renaissance led by free spirits and philosophers of the future. These exceptional individuals would not rule others in any conventional political sense, but would influence culture through their creative achievements and the power of their ideas and examples. They would create conditions in which other talented individuals could develop their own capacities and make their own contributions to human excellence without being constrained by either democratic conformity pressure or aristocratic privilege systems. This would require new forms of social organization that could balance individual freedom with cultural standards, personal autonomy with collective responsibility, and innovation with tradition. The practical implementation of such alternatives faces enormous challenges in contemporary circumstances where democratic ideologies and institutions have become deeply embedded in social structures and popular consciousness. Most people have been educated to believe that democracy represents the highest form of political organization, and that alternatives necessarily involve oppression and injustice. They cannot imagine forms of cultural hierarchy based on merit and achievement rather than inherited privilege or political manipulation. Overcoming these limitations would require sustained cultural work to demonstrate the possibility and desirability of post-democratic forms of social organization that could better serve human flourishing and creative development. The ultimate significance of Nietzsche's critique of democracy lies not in providing specific political programs or institutional reforms, but in challenging fundamental assumptions about equality, popular sovereignty and mass culture that prevent contemporary societies from creating conditions favourable to human excellence and cultural achievement. By understanding the psychological and cultural roots of democratic ideology, individuals can begin to free themselves from its limitations and explore alternative ways of organizing their personal lives and social relationships. This liberation is essential preparation for the cultural transformation that Nietzsche believed would be necessary to avoid civilizational decline and create new possibilities for human greatness in the post-religious era. Whether such transformation becomes possible depends largely on whether enough exceptional individuals can recognize the problems he identified and develop practical solutions that could guide humanity toward healthier forms of social and cultural organization. Part 14. Psychology and the Unconscious, the Hidden Drives Behind Human Behavior. Nietzsche's pioneering insights into human psychology anticipated many of the discoveries that would later be developed by Freud, Jung, and other depth psychologists. But his approach was fundamentally different from theirs in its emphasis on power, creativity, and the potential for psychological health, rather than pathology and dysfunction. He recognized that human behavior is driven primarily by unconscious forces that people rarely understand or acknowledge. But he saw these forces as expressions of life energy and creative potential, rather than as symptoms of repression or neurotic conflict. His psychological investigations aimed not merely to understand how the mind works, but to identify ways of organizing psychological life that could enhance human capabilities and promote individual excellence rather than merely reducing suffering or achieving social adjustment. This positive and creative approach to psychology provides essential insights for anyone seeking to understand and transcend the limitations of ordinary human consciousness and behavior. The concept of the unconscious in Nietzsche's psychology differs significantly from the Freudian unconscious that would later become familiar to educated audiences throughout the Western world. Rather than viewing unconscious mental processes as primarily defensive or pathological, Nietzsche understood them as the source of creativity, intuition, and vital energy that conscious rational thought often constrains or misdirects. The unconscious contains not just repressed memories and forbidden desires, but also unrealized potentials and creative possibilities that have not yet found adequate expression in conscious thought and behavior. Accessing and integrating these unconscious resources represents one of the most important tasks for anyone seeking to achieve psychological integration and personal excellence. Nietzsche's analysis of moral psychology reveals how deeply ethical beliefs and behaviors are shaped by unconscious drives and motivations that have little to do with rational, moral reasoning or conscious choice. People typically believe that they act according to moral principles that they have consciously adopted based on careful consideration of right and wrong. But psychological investigation reveals that their actual behavior is driven by unconscious needs for power, recognition, security, or revenge that they rationalize after the fact through moral language and concepts. Understanding these hidden motivations allows individuals to become more honest about their real reasons for acting and to make more conscious choices about which drives and impulses they want to cultivate or suppress. The phenomenon of self-deception represents one of the most important and pervasive aspects of human psychology that Nietzsche analyzed with exceptional insight and subtlety. Most people engage in systematic forms of self-deception that allow them to maintain comfortable illusions about themselves and their circumstances, while avoiding difficult truths that would require them to change their behavior or acknowledge their limitations. These self-deceptive strategies often involve what Nietzsche called psychological tricks, such as selective attention, rationalization, projection, and the creation of elaborate justifications for actions that actually serve unconscious needs for power, comfort, or social approval. Recognizing and overcoming these self-deceptive patterns is essential for achieving genuine self-knowledge and authentic personal development. The psychology of resentment receives particularly detailed analysis in Nietzsche's psychological investigations because he identified it as one of the most destructive and widespread psychological patterns in modern civilization. Resentment emerges when people feel powerless to achieve their goals or express their values directly, and instead focus their energy on criticizing and undermining those who have achieved what they cannot achieve themselves. Rather than working to improve their own capabilities or circumstances, resentful individuals seek to diminish others through moral criticism, social pressure, or political action that brings everyone down to their level. This psychological pattern becomes particularly toxic when it becomes systematized in moral, religious, or political ideologies that make virtues out of weakness and vices out of strength. The relationship between consciousness and the body represents another crucial aspect of Nietzsche's psychological insights that challenged traditional philosophical assumptions about the mind-body relationship. Rather than treating the mind as a separate substance that controls or inhabits the body, he understood consciousness as a relatively recent and sophisticated development that emerges from and remains dependent upon bodily processes and instinctual drives. Much of what people attribute to purely mental or spiritual causes actually originates in physiological conditions, biochemical processes, and evolutionary adaptations that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. This embodied understanding of psychology suggests that psychological health requires attention to physical health, and that attempts to achieve spiritual development while ignoring or suppressing bodily needs are likely to create internal conflicts and psychological dysfunction. Nietzsche's concept of psychological types provides a framework for understanding how different individuals organize their mental and emotional lives in characteristically different ways that reflect their underlying drives, values, and life circumstances. Rather than assuming that all people share the same psychological structure and should be evaluated according to universal standards, he recognized that different psychological types have different strengths, weaknesses, and developmental possibilities. What promotes health and growth in one type of person may be harmful or inappropriate for another type, suggesting the need for individualized approaches to psychological development and moral evaluation rather than one-size-fits-all prescriptions and judgments. This typological approach anticipates later developments in personality psychology while maintaining a more dynamic and developmental perspective than most contemporary theories. The creative and destructive aspects of human psychology receive equal attention in Nietzsche's analysis because he recognized that the same psychological energies that produce the greatest human achievements can also produce the most terrible forms of cruelty and destruction when they are misdirected or perverted. Psychological health involves learning to channel aggressive and acquisitive drives toward constructive purposes rather than trying to eliminate them entirely, which is both impossible and undesirable. The goal is psychological integration rather than psychological purity, accepting and directing all aspects of human nature rather than trying to repress or deny those aspects that seem socially unacceptable or morally problematic. This requires tremendous psychological sophistication and self-knowledge, since it means taking responsibility for potentially dangerous impulses rather than simply following conventional moral rules that may not be adequate for exceptional individuals or unusual circumstances. The social dimensions of psychology also receive extensive analysis in Nietzsche's investigations, since he recognized that individual psychological development cannot be separated from the cultural and social context in which it occurs. Different societies and historical periods create different possibilities and constraints for psychological growth. encouraging some aspects of human nature while discouraging others. Understanding these social influences allows individuals to become more conscious about which aspects of their psychology reflect their own authentic nature and which aspects represent internalized social expectations or cultural conditioning. This awareness creates possibilities for what Nietzsche called psychological freedom, the ability to choose consciously which social influences to accept and which to resist based on their contribution to personal development and life enhancement rather than mere social acceptability. The therapeutic implications of Nietzsche's psychological insights focus on promoting psychological strength and creative capacity, rather than merely reducing symptoms or achieving social adjustment. Rather than helping people adapt better to existing social conditions that may themselves be psychologically unhealthy, Nietzschean therapy would aim to develop the inner resources necessary for authentic self-expression and creative achievement, even when such development creates conflict with conventional expectations and social norms. This requires therapists who are themselves psychologically sophisticated and culturally independent, rather than mere technicians who apply standardized methods without regard for the unique developmental needs and possibilities of different individuals. The goal is not psychological normality, but psychological excellence, not the elimination of all psychological conflict, but the creative resolution of conflicts through higher forms of integration and self-organization. The developmental aspects of Nietzsche's psychology emphasize the possibility of continued psychological growth and transformation throughout the entire lifespan, rather than assuming that personality becomes fixed in childhood or early adulthood. He envisioned individuals who could continue experimenting with different ways of organizing their psychological life, developing new capacities and interests, and transcending previous limitations and identifications. This experimental approach to personal development requires treating one's own psychology as raw material to be shaped and refined, rather than as a fixed given that must be accepted without modification. It also requires the courage to abandon psychological patterns and identities that no longer serve developmental purposes, even when such abandonment creates temporary confusion or social disapproval. The ultimate significance of Nietzsche's psychological insights lies in their potential to liberate human beings from unnecessary psychological limitations and create new possibilities for individual development and cultural achievement. By understanding how the mind actually works beneath the surface of conscious intentions and rational explanations, people can begin to take more conscious responsibility for their psychological life and direct their energies toward more constructive and fulfilling purposes. This psychological awareness is essential preparation for the kind of radical self-transformation that Nietzsche associated with the development of free spirits and overmen who could transcend the limitations of ordinary human consciousness and create new forms of excellence and meaning. Whether such transformation becomes widely available depends largely on whether his psychological insights can be developed into practical methods for promoting psychological growth and cultural renewal. Part 15. The Eternal Return of Cultural Cycles and the Future of Humanity. Nietzsche's vision of human cultural development reveals a cyclical understanding of history that differs radically from both traditional religious accounts of linear progression toward salvation and modern secular accounts of inevitable progress toward enlightenment and universal prosperity. He observed that civilizations rise and decline in recurring patterns, developing sophisticated cultural achievements during periods of vitality and creativity, then gradually decaying as these achievements become institutionalized, democratized, and reduced to mere conventions that no longer inspire genuine commitment or creative energy. This cyclical perspective provides crucial insights into the current crisis of Western civilization and suggests both the inevitability of cultural decline and the possibility of cultural renewal through the emergence of new forms of excellence and meaning that could initiate another cycle of creative development. Understanding these cultural rhythms is essential for anyone seeking to contribute constructively to humanity's long-term development rather than merely reacting to immediate circumstances and temporary trends. The pattern of cultural rise and decline that Nietzsche identified begins with periods of cultural youth when vital energies are directed toward creative expression and the development of new forms of art, philosophy, religion, and social organization. During these periods, exceptional individuals emerge who can synthesize existing cultural resources with fresh insights and experiences to create original works and ideas that expand human possibilities and understanding. These cultural innovations inspire others and create conditions favorable to further creativity and achievement, leading to what Nietzsche called golden ages, when an entire civilization seems to be developing its distinctive capacities and contributing something valuable to human culture. Ancient Athens during the 5th century before Christ and Renaissance Italy during the 14th and 15th centuries represent examples of such creative periods when human excellence flourished across multiple domains simultaneously. But Nietzsche also observed that these creative periods inevitably lead to their own exhaustion and decline as their achievements become systematized, institutionalized, and made accessible to broader populations who lack the original vision and creative energy of their creators. What begins as inspired innovation gradually becomes conventional wisdom. What starts as personal excellence becomes social expectation, and what emerges from individual creativity becomes mass production and consumption. The democratization of cultural achievements may make them more widely available, but also dilutes their intensity and transformative power, creating what Nietzsche called cultural decadence, where people possess the forms of past greatness without understanding their spirit or being able to create new forms appropriate to their own circumstances and possibilities. This process of cultural decline appears to be an inevitable consequence of cultural success rather than simply the result of external factors or historical accidents. The current crisis of Western civilization represents what Nietzsche saw as the final stage of Christian cultural development, when the values and institutions that had sustained European culture for over a millennium were losing their credibility and effectiveness without being replaced by adequate alternatives. The death of God was both a symptom and a cause of this cultural exhaustion, revealing that the spiritual foundations of European civilization had eroded, while the social and political structures built upon these foundations continued to operate through institutional momentum rather than genuine conviction. This creates what Nietzsche called a period of nihilism, when people lose faith in existing meanings and purposes but have not yet developed new ones that could guide individual development and social organization in healthier directions. Such transitional periods are both dangerous and promising, threatening civilizational collapse while also creating opportunities for cultural innovation and renewal that would be impossible during periods of cultural stability and confidence. The emergence of what Nietzsche called the last men represents the most troubling possibility for how this cultural crisis might be resolved. Rather than facing the challenge of creating new forms of meaning and value, most people might choose the path of least resistance by focusing exclusively on comfort, security, and immediate gratification, while abandoning all higher aspirations and cultural responsibilities. This would lead to a form of civilizational stagnation where technological progress continues but spiritual and cultural development ceases, creating societies of sophisticated barbarians who possess advanced tools but lack the wisdom and vision necessary to use them constructively. Such societies might persist for centuries or even millennia, but would contribute nothing to human development and would be vulnerable to collapse when they encounter challenges that require creativity, courage, and cultural resources beyond mere technical expertise. But Nietzsche also envisioned more hopeful possibilities for how the current cultural crisis might lead to genuine renewal rather than mere stagnation or decline. The breakdown of traditional authorities and meaning systems could create space for exceptional individuals to develop new forms of excellence and create cultural innovations that could initiate another cycle of creative development. These free spirits and philosophers of the future would combine the psychological sophistication developed during the Christian period with the life-affirming energy of pre-Christian culture to create something unprecedented in human history. Their achievements could inspire others and gradually influence broader cultural development in ways that would restore conditions favorable to human excellence and creative achievement. The global dimensions of contemporary cultural development add complexity to this cyclical pattern, since different civilizations are at different stages of their cultural development and are increasingly in contact with each other through technological and economic connections. The decline of Western civilization coincides with the rise of other cultural traditions that may be entering their own creative periods or may be adopting Western innovations while avoiding some of Western decadence and spiritual exhaustion. This creates possibilities for cultural synthesis and mutual enrichment that have never existed before in human history, but it also creates dangers of cultural homogenization and the loss of distinctive traditions that have contributed to human diversity and creativity. The outcome of these global cultural interactions may determine whether humanity as a whole enters a period of creative development or succumbs to worldwide cultural mediocrity and stagnation. The role of technology in cultural development presents both opportunities and threats that Nietzsche could only anticipate in general terms, but that have become increasingly relevant as technological power continues to expand. Advanced technology can provide tools that enhance human creativity and make cultural achievements more widely accessible, but it can also become a substitute for genuine cultural development and spiritual growth. Societies that focus primarily on technological advancement without corresponding development of wisdom, virtue, and cultural excellence may create powerful civilizations that lack the psychological and spiritual resources necessary for using their power constructively. The result could be technological barbarism, where advanced tools are used by people who have not developed the cultural sophistication necessary to avoid destroying themselves and their environment through the misuse of their capabilities. The educational implications of understanding cultural cycles suggest the need for approaches to human development that can prepare individuals to contribute to cultural renewal rather than merely adapting to existing cultural conditions. This would require education that develops psychological strength and creative capacity, rather than just technical skills and social conformity, that encourages independent thinking and cultural criticism rather than uncritical acceptance of current trends and popular opinions. Most importantly, it would require education that helps individuals understand their historical situation and cultural responsibilities, rather than treating them as isolated consumers whose primary goal is personal satisfaction and social success. Such education could help create the cultural conditions necessary for the emergence of exceptional individuals who could initiate new cycles of creative development and cultural excellence. The practical implications of this cyclical understanding for contemporary individuals involve recognizing both the limitations of current cultural resources and the opportunities created by cultural transitions for personal development and creative contribution. Rather than lamenting the decline of traditional authorities and meaning systems, individuals can learn to see this decline as creating space for new forms of excellence and achievement that would be impossible during periods of cultural stability and conventional success. This requires developing the psychological resources necessary to thrive during transitional periods when external guidance is limited and social support for exceptional development may be minimal. It also requires cultivating the vision and courage necessary to create new possibilities rather than simply reacting to existing circumstances or accepting whatever cultural developments happen to occur. The ultimate significance of understanding cultural cycles lies in its potential to provide hope and direction for humanity's long-term development, despite the apparent decline of contemporary civilization. Rather than viewing current problems as evidence of permanent human limitations or the inevitable failure of all cultural achievements, this cyclical perspective suggests that decline and renewal are natural aspects of cultural development that create opportunities as well as challenges. The question is not whether cultural renewal will occur, but what forms it will take and whether contemporary individuals will contribute constructively to it or merely witness it as passive observers. Nietzsche's vision suggests that the future of humanity depends largely on whether enough exceptional individuals can understand their historical situation and take responsibility for creating the cultural innovations that could guide humanity toward higher forms of development and achievement rather than allowing it to sink into permanent mediocrity or barbarism. This cyclical understanding also suggests that the achievements of past civilizations are not permanently lost, but remain available as resources for future cultural development when conditions become favorable for their rediscovery and creative reinterpretation. The decline of particular cultural traditions does not eliminate the human capacities and insights they embodied, but simply creates the need for new forms of expression and organization that can make these resources relevant to contemporary circumstances and possibilities. In this sense, cultural development is not linear progress toward a final goal, but an endless creative process where humanity continues to explore different possibilities for excellence, meaning and achievement without ever exhausting the potential for new discoveries and innovations. Understanding this process allows individuals to participate consciously in humanity's long-term cultural development, rather than being swept along by forces they cannot understand or influence. Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophical legacy continues to challenge and inspire more than a century after his death, because he confronted the fundamental questions that humanity must answer as it navigates the transition from traditional religious civilization to whatever post-traditional possibilities await discovery and creation. His diagnosis of nihilism and cultural decline proved remarkably prophetic. His psychological insights anticipated developments in multiple fields of human understanding, and his vision of human potential continues to offer hope for transcending the limitations that constrain most contemporary existence. Whether his philosophical insights can contribute to genuine cultural renewal and individual development depends largely on whether contemporary readers have the courage to embrace the radical freedom and responsibility that his philosophy demands. For those willing to undertake this challenge, Nietzsche offers not comfortable answers or easy solutions, but the intellectual tools and spiritual inspiration necessary for creating new possibilities worthy of human aspiration and achievement in an uncertain but potentially magnificent future.